The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Mara Ellison would remember for the rest of her life, not because Tuesdays had ever meant anything to her before, but because after that particular one, they never meant anything small again. The man who delivered it didn't knock. He let himself through the gate of her rented room in Silver Creek, walked up the 2-porch steps like he owned them, and slid the envelope under her door with the flat, practiced motion of someone who had done this many times and felt nothing about it. By the time Mara heard the paper scrape across the floorboards and opened the door, he was already back on the street, his coat collar turned up, his face turned away. He didn't look back. Men like that never did. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize, a tight, angular script. The letters pressed hard into the paper like the writer had wanted to leave marks. Miss Mara Ellison. Property of the late Harold Ellison. Regarding outstanding debt. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the cold air moving past her into the small room, and she read those words 3 times. Then she closed the door, sat down at the edge of her bed, and opened it. Before you hear what was in that letter, before any of this goes further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. What would you do if someone tried to take everything from you? Not through violence, not through anything you could fight with your hands, but through paperwork, through signatures you never made, through a system designed by powerful men who assumed that a woman like Mara, a woman who carried her grief in her body and her courage in her jaw, would simply give way. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told in small or enormous ways that you didn't belong at the table, this story is for you. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that Tuesday. The letter was from a law firm in Philadelphia called Holt, Crane, and Mercer, and before Mara had finished the first paragraph, her hands had stopped shaking and gone very still, which was, for her, the more frightening of the 2 states. Harold had owed money, the letter said, a sum of $412 to a creditor named Cornelius Fitch, related to a business arrangement made in the winter of 1882. The debt had gone unresolved at the time of Harold's death. The firm now represented Mr. Fitch's estate, and they were prepared to pursue collection through whatever legal mechanism was available to them, including, if necessary, a claim against any property held in Harold's name at the time of his death. Mara read that last line again. Any property held in Harold's name at the time of his death. She folded the letter carefully, smoothed the crease with her thumb, and set it on the table beside the window. Outside, Silver Creek was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, men moving between the general store and the saloon, a pair of horses tied at the post, the smell of cold mud and wood smoke that she had come to associate with this place. A woman she didn't know well, the wife of one of the grain merchants, walked past on the opposite boardwalk and looked up at Mara's window. When she saw Mara looking back, she dropped her gaze and kept walking. Mara had lived in Silver Creek for 4 months. She knew what people thought of her. She was not naive about it, she never had been. A woman her size, alone, recently widowed, moving herself to a frontier Montana town without family or sponsor, drew a particular kind of attention. Most of it wasn't kind, some of it wasn't even subtle. There had been remarks in the Mercantile said just loudly enough to be heard. There had been a morning when she'd gone to arrange a line of credit at the bank, and the man behind the counter had looked her up and down and told her, with a small practiced smile, that the bank would need to see some evidence of collateral before it could extend credit to someone in her situation. Her situation, as if widowhood were a character flaw. She had thanked him and walked out. She had not cried until she was back in her room with the door closed, and even then it was the brief, furious kind of crying that came from anger more than grief, the kind that left her steadier afterward rather than wrung out. 4 months in Silver Creek, and she had made exactly one thing she would call a friend, and she was not entirely sure he would use that word himself. She had met Wyatt Mercer by accident. It had been her 3rd week in town, and she had made a wrong turn on a road she didn't know yet, and ended up in front of a property that looked abandoned from the outside shuttered windows, fence posts leaning, no smoke from the chimney. She had stopped to consult the rough map she'd drawn herself from other people's descriptions, and she was still squinting at it when she heard a horse come up the road behind her. The rider didn't say anything at first. He just pulled up alongside her and looked at the map in her hands, then at her, then at the property. "That's my land," he said. He wasn't young. Somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, with the particular weathered quality that Montana winters put into a man's face, not old, exactly, but layered like wood that had been through seasons. He had a short beard that needed attention, and his coat had been mended in 2 places, badly, by someone who wasn't practiced at it. She would later learn he had done it himself. "I'm not trespassing," Mara said, because she wasn't. "She was on the road, I know." He looked at her map again. "You're holding it sideways." She looked down. He was right. She turned it. The road she wanted was 2 left turns back, not 3. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and rode on. He didn't introduce himself. She found out his name later, from the woman who ran the laundry, who mentioned him the way people mentioned Landmark's Wyatt Mercer, the one who lost his wife and baby 7 years ago and never quite came back from it, who spent months at a stretch up in the mountains trapping and came home to an empty cabin and seemed to prefer it that way. "He's not unfriendly," the woman had said, in the tone of someone offering the kindest thing they could find. "He just doesn't see the point of people much anymore." Mara had thought about that for a long time. She understood it, in the way that grief survivors recognize each other across distance, not because the losses are the same, but because the particular shape of a person who has been hollowed out and kept going anyway has its own silhouette. Harold's death had not destroyed her, but it had changed the texture of everything. She had loved him. Not perfectly, they had argued. She had been impatient with him. He had kept things from her that he shouldn't have, but she had loved him, and losing him had left a specific kind of quiet in her life that she had not yet figured out what to do with. She had come to Montana because staying in Pennsylvania felt like staying inside a closed room. She had told herself she needed air. She had told herself it was temporary. She was starting to think she had been lying to herself about the temporary part. The first time she went to Wyatt Mercer's cabin uninvited, she told herself she was bringing back a tool she'd borrowed from his neighbor, who had pointed her toward Wyatt's road by mistake. The second time, she didn't bother with an excuse. She had made a pot of bean soup the day before, more than she could eat, and she walked the half-mile to his cabin in the early evening, with the pot wrapped in her coat, and knocked on his door. He opened it and looked at her, and then at the pot, with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite welcome. "You made too much," he said. "I always make too much," she said. "It's a flaw." He looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the door wider and let her in. They ate the soup without much talking, which suited her fine. He asked, at some point, where she was from. She told him Pennsylvania. He asked if she planned to go back. She said she didn't know yet. He didn't ask anything else, and she didn't offer anything else, and she left when the soup was gone and the fire was low. When she knocked the following Tuesday, he opened the door before she'd finished the second knock, which told her he'd heard her coming up the road. He'd made coffee, 2 cups. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. That was how it started. Now it was 3 weeks since Wyatt had left for the mountain trail, a longer stretch than usual, following a season of particularly good trapping conditions, and Mara sat alone in her rented room with the letter from Holt, Crane, and Mercer on the table beside the window and tried to think through what she knew. What she knew was this: Harold had owed money. Harold had owed money to a man named Cornelius Fitch, and that man was now dead, and his estate was using that debt to reach into Mara's life and close a fist around something she had not realized anyone else knew existed: the land in western Pennsylvania. It was 43 acres, most of it forested, with a creek running through the lower third. Harold had inherited it from his uncle when Mara was still engaged to him before the wedding, and he had never paid it much attention. They had lived in town. He had worked at the assay office, and the land had been something abstract, something distant, something they talked about occasionally as a thing that might become useful someday. Then, in the summer, before Harold died, 2 men from a company called Blackridge Mining had come to the house. Mara had not been home for the first visit. She came back to find Harold sitting at the kitchen table, with an expression she had not seen on him before, not quite fear, not quite calculation, but something in between that she would later understand as the face of a man who has just understood that something he owns is worth a great deal more than he believed. The Blackridge men had made an offer for the land. Harold had declined. They had come back 6 weeks later, this time with a higher number. Harold had declined again. He had told Mara that night, in bed, that he felt certain the land was worth more than they were offering, and that more importantly, he didn't like the way they'd looked at him when he said no, like it was a temporary condition, like it was something they planned to wait out. 2 months after the second visit, Harold developed a fever. It came on fast. A Monday he was fine. A Wednesday he was in bed. A Friday the doctor was there with his bag and his careful face. By the following Tuesday he was gone. Mara had told herself it was sickness. People died of fever. It happened. She had buried him and sold the house and come to Montana because she needed to be somewhere she had not watched him die, and she had told herself not to build explanations out of grief and coincidence. But the letter in her hand was dated 3 weeks ago, sent from Philadelphia and signed by a firm she had never heard of, on behalf of a creditor she had never met, pursuing a debt for an amount of money that was precisely large enough to justify a legal claim, while being precisely small enough to seem almost ordinary. and something in the careful architecture of that letter made the back of her neck go cold. She went to find the only person in Silver Creek she trusted. Eliza Greer ran the seamstress shop on the east end of town, a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a habit of seeing through things. She had been one of the first people in Silver Creek to speak to Mara, without the particular sideways quality, that most conversations had the slight edge of judgment, the careful measuring. Eliza had simply asked her what she needed, and listened to the answer, and that had been enough to establish something between them that Mara would call trust, provisionally. She found Eliza in the back of the shop pinning a hem, and waited until the customer left before she put the letter on the workbench. Eliza read it. She read it again more slowly, the way she read everything. $400, she said. 12, Mara said. 412. A real creditor chasing a real debt doesn't send lawyers from Philadelphia to collect $400 from a widow in Montana. Eliza set the letter down. The cost of the letter alone would eat half that. I know, so the money isn't what they want. No. Mara looked at the letter on the workbench. They want the land. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, does anyone in this town know about the land? It was a good question. A careful question. The kind that got to the center of things without going around the edges. Mara thought about it. She had not talked about the Pennsylvania property with anyone in Silver Creek. She had mentioned Harold, his name, his death, the broad shape of widowhood, in the way that circumstances sometimes required, when someone asked why she was alone or where she'd come from. But the land itself, the Blackridge offer, the letter that had come with the fever, those were things she had kept inside herself. And yet, somehow $412 worth of debt had found her in a rented room in a Montana town she had arrived at half by accident. Someone told them where I was, Mara said. Eliza didn't disagree. The town of Silver Creek had opinions about Mara Ellison that it shared freely, and without much concern for accuracy. The prevailing view, as near as Mara had been able to reconstruct it from overheard conversations and the specific quality of certain silences, was that she had come to Montana to find a new husband, that her size made this unlikely, that she had fixed her attention on Wyatt Mercer because he owned a decent piece of land and was not known to be discerning about company, and that the whole situation was slightly embarrassing and would probably resolve itself when she ran out of money and went home. There was a woman named Dorothea Hatch who served as the primary engine of this particular narrative. Dorothea was tall, angular, somewhere in her mid-40s, married to the man who owned the largest grain operation in the area, and possessed of the kind of social confidence that comes from having decided early in life that judgment is a form of intelligence. She had made a remark about Mara at the dry goods store that Mara had not heard directly but that had been reported to her, in the careful way these things travel, by two separate people who both seemed to believe they were doing her a kindness. The remark had concerned the amount of venison stew required to keep a woman of Mara's proportions fed through a Montana winter, and whether Wyatt Mercer had thought through the mathematics before allowing her into his home. Mara had thanked both people for telling her, and then gone back to her room and spent 20 minutes staring at the ceiling, working through the arithmetic of how much she cared about Dorothea Hatch's opinion, and arriving at a number that was not quite zero, but was close enough to proceed as though it were. She did not have the luxury of being wounded by Dorothea Hatch. She had other problems. The man she did not recognize began watching her on a Thursday. She noticed him the first time outside the Mercantile, a compact man in a dark coat, standing at the corner of the building with no obvious reason for being there. He was looking at her directly, which was what made her notice him, because most people who stared at her had the instinct to look away when caught. This man did not look away. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned and walked down the alley beside the building and was gone. She told herself she was imagining significance, told herself she was in an overwrought state because of the letter, reading threat into everything. She saw him again on Saturday, on the other side of the street, while she was coming back from Eliza's shop. Same dark coat, same direct look, same absence of embarrassment when she noticed him. On Sunday, she looked out her window before dawn and thought she saw a figure standing near the gate at the end of the yard. By the time she'd pulled on her coat and opened the door, there was no one there, only the cold and the sound of wind. She needed Wyatt to come home. She was irritated at herself for needing it. She had managed alone for 4 months. She had managed alone for the 2 years since Harold died. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She knew that with a bone-deep certainty that no amount of Dorothea Hatch could shake. But needing someone's presence and needing rescue were different things, and she had not had anyone in a long time whose presence felt like company rather than performance, and she missed it. More than that, she needed someone who would listen without making assumptions. Someone who had learned over a handful of Tuesday and Friday evenings with soup and coffee and occasional long silences that she was more capable than she appeared, and more troubled than she let on. On a night when the wind was particularly cruel and the cold had settled into the walls of her rented room, Mara made a decision. She had made decisions before. She was not impulsive by nature. Harold had been the impulsive one. She had always been the steadier one, the one who thought things through and then committed entirely. But this was a decision that formed quickly, with a clarity that felt almost physical, and she recognized it as the kind that doesn't improve with more thinking. She took out a piece of paper and wrote a note. She addressed it to the law firm in Philadelphia, acknowledging receipt of their correspondence, and requesting the specific documentation of the debt, the original agreement, the date, the creditor's signature, a delaying measure, and a legitimate one. She knew enough about how these things worked to know that demanding documentation bought time, and time was what she needed. She folded the note and set it on the table for the Morning Post. Then she took out a second piece of paper and wrote a much shorter note. She folded this one too, and tucked it in her coat pocket. If Wyatt Mercer came home from the mountains to an empty cabin, she wanted him to know she'd been there. She was not sure later how she had known he was coming home that night. It was not a thing she could explain precisely. She had tracked the weeks he'd been gone. She knew roughly the length of his usual trips, and there was a feeling in the air that she might have dismissed as wishful thinking, but chose instead to trust. She walked the half-mile in the dark with her pot, the same pot she always brought, this time full of venison stew she had been making since mid-afternoon. The cold was significant. Her breath came in visible puffs, and her fingers ached inside her gloves, but she kept moving, because she was good at that. His cabin was dark when she arrived. No smoke from the chimney. She let herself in with the spare key he had given her without ceremony. About 6 weeks earlier, he had simply put it on the table when she arrived one Tuesday and said, in that particular way he had of making things seem smaller than they were, in case you come early and it's cold. She built the fire, she hung her pot, she set 2 plates on the table, and then she sat in the chair by the fire and waited. She did not think about the letter, or the man in the dark coat, or Dorothea Hatch, or the 43 acres of Pennsylvania forest that someone wanted badly enough to send lawyers across the country. She sat in a warm cabin with the sound of a fire and a pot of stew, and she thought about the quiet, and how it had changed character, how the same quiet that felt empty in her rented room felt in this cabin like something that could hold her without crushing her. She was almost asleep when she heard the horse, then the creak of the door, then the specific quality of silence that meant someone had stopped moving because they had seen something unexpected. She looked up. Wyatt stood in the doorway, coat still on, trail dirt on his boots, one hand very close to the revolver on his hip. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not fear exactly, but the focused, ready stillness of a man who has spent years in places where something unfamiliar could turn dangerous. She did not flinch. She had lived through worse than a man's startled caution. I heard you were coming home tonight, she said. I thought someone ought to be waiting. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. The hand moved away from the revolver. His expression did something complicated, something she wouldn't have been able to name if she had to. A kind of slow recognition, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. He stepped inside. He took off his coat. He sat down at the table without saying anything, and she ladled the stew into his plate, and she sat across from him, and the fire did what fires do. Long trip, she said. Long enough. I need to tell you something. He looked up from the stew. Not tonight, she said. Eat first. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him measuring at the something in her voice that wasn't quite the usual Tuesday or Friday thing. The particular straightness in her back that he had probably learned to read by now as the posture she took on when she was holding something difficult. He looked back down at his plate. All right, he said. Tomorrow. They ate in the same comfortable silence they always managed, but underneath it now was the thing she hadn't said yet, sitting between them like a third guest at the table patient. Present, not going anywhere. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, the fire burned, the stew was good, and the cabin was warm, and for a little while, in the space between one day and what was coming, Mara Ellison's let herself simply be here. She had not managed that in a long time. She was going to need it, because tomorrow would change everything, and she had a feeling that the man across the table from her was already starting to understand that, even though she hadn't told him anything yet. That was the thing about Wyatt Mercer that she hadn't expected when she'd first turned the map right side up on that road 4 months ago. He was the kind of quiet that heard things, and there was so much now that needed to be heard. He told her to sleep in the chair by the fire, which was not a comfortable chair, and she did not argue with him about it because she could see he meant it practically, rather than as a gesture of any kind. The chair was closest to the heat, and the cold outside had not let up. And Wyatt Mercer was a man who solved the immediate problem in front of him without dressing it up. She woke before he did, when the fire had dropped to coals, and she built it back up and put the coffee on and sat at the table, with the letter from Holt, Crane, and Mercer in front of her, and read it again in the early gray light. She had read it enough times now that she had it nearly memorized, but she kept reading it because she was hoping she had some phrase or qualification that would make the whole thing smaller and more manageable. She had not missed anything. The letter was exactly as threatening as it had been the first time. Wyatt came out of the back room when the coffee was ready. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at her face. He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, and sat down. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She did not tell it in order, which was not her habit. She was usually a linear thinker, a woman who laid things out sequentially and built toward conclusions, but this particular story did not want to be told in order because the pieces of it kept pulling against each other. So she told it the way it had actually arrived in her understanding. The letter first, then the land, then Harold and the Blackridge men, then the fever, then the man in the dark coat watching her on the street. Wyatt listened without interrupting. This was something she had noticed about him early. He had the particular discipline of a man who understood that interrupting someone mid-sentence cost you information, and he never interrupted unless he was clarifying a fact. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The man in the coat," he said. "How many times?" "3 times, I'm sure of. Possibly a 4th, but it was dark and I couldn't be certain." "Where was he standing the 2nd time?" "Across the street from Eliza Greer's shop." Wyatt wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "He wasn't there by accident." "I know, and you think someone in town sent information to Philadelphia. About where you were, someone told them." "I didn't tell anyone." He looked at the letter, then at her. "You didn't tell me about the land." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered in a neutral voice, but it had an edge to it, not of anger, but of something more complicated. The kind of thing a person feels when they realize they knew someone less completely than they believed. "No," she said, "I didn't." "Why not?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you yet. And because if I told you about it, it would stop being a thing I was managing quietly and become a problem that involved you. I wasn't sure I had the right to involve you." He was quiet for a moment. "You were sitting in my cabin at midnight," he said. "I'd say you'd already involved me." Something in his voice was not quite dry humor and not quite reproach. It landed somewhere between the two, and she felt it land, and she thought that was probably fair. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I had." The town of Silver Creek conducted its social life primarily through the machinery of the general store, the saloon, the Sunday egg gathering at the meeting hall, and because Mara did not drink and had no religion, her intelligence network was limited to Eliza Greer and a woman named Paulette Marsh, who worked at the post office and had the kind of naturally curious temperament that made her notice things. Paulette had mentioned 2 weeks ago that an envelope had come through the outgoing post, addressed to a firm in Philadelphia. She had not looked at the full name, but she remembered the city because it was unusual for Silver Creek, and she remembered the handwriting because it was the same kind of tight, angular script she associated with one particular person in town. Mara had not asked her to say more. She had thanked her and thought about it. The handwriting on the letter from Holt, Crane, and Mercer was tight and angular. She mentioned this to Wyatt over a second cup of coffee and watched him process it with the focused quality of a man working through a problem that had practical consequences. "Who writes like that?" he said. "I don't know for certain, but I know someone who handles a great deal of correspondence for a great deal of people in this town." He looked at her. "The grain merchant's wife," she said. "Dorothea Hatch." The name landed in the room with a weight that surprised her slightly. She could see from Wyatt's expression that it meant something to him, though his face was not a generous reporter of his interior states. "Hatch," he said after a moment. "Edmund Hatch's wife." "You know him?" "I know his land borders 3 other properties in this valley, and every owner who's tried to sell in the last 4 years has ended up selling to him at a number that was lower than it should have been." He paused. "I know he had a business arrangement with a man from back east a couple of years ago. Investor type. The arrangement didn't last long, and I never heard what happened to it." Mara set down her cup. "What kind of investor? Mining. At least that's what people said at the time." The silence that followed had a different quality than their usual silences. It was the silence of 2 people arriving at the same uneasy place from different directions. "Blackridge Mining made me 2 offers, Mara said slowly. Harold refused both. 6 months later, lawyers from Philadelphia are writing to me about a $400 debt, and someone in this town knew where to send the letter. And there's a man I don't know watching my movements on the street." Wyatt stood up. He put his empty cup on the shelf with the particular deliberateness of a man who is doing something simple with his hands while his mind is occupied elsewhere. "I'm going into town," he said. "To do what?" "Talk to some people." She said his name flatly, not as a question. Don't do anything that makes this louder than it already is. He looked at her. You think I'm going to go start something? I think you're a man who has been alone in the mountains for 3 weeks and has just come home to find out that someone is watching the woman who fills his cabin with warmth on Tuesdays and Fridays. And I think that particular combination of circumstances produces a certain impulse. The expression on his face was difficult to read. She had gotten better at reading him over 4 months, but he still had registers she could not fully access. What she could see was that she had said something accurate enough to require him to pause. I was just going to ask some questions, he said. I know. But the asking itself sends a message. Let me think for a day first. He stood at the shelf with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned around and sat back down. One day, he said. Mara spent that day the way she spent most difficult days, working with her hands while her mind ran separately. She had been helping Eliza Greer with alterations. For the past 2 months, it was not paid employment exactly. But Eliza had a way of pressing bolts of fabric on her with casual insistence. And Mara had a way of leaving things she'd baked on Eliza's workbench. And the economy of it suited both of them without requiring any formal agreement. She sat with a half-finished bodice in her lap and stitched steadily and thought about what she knew. She knew the debt was real. Harold had not been perfectly careful with money. He had been generous when he shouldn't have been, and trusting in ways that sometimes cost him. And it was possible he genuinely owed $412 to a man named Cornelius Fitch. What she did not know was whether Fitch had died naturally and his estate had stumbled onto the debt organically, or whether the debt had been located with intention, found and purchased, and weaponized by someone who wanted to put legal pressure on a Pennsylvania property title without appearing to do so directly. The land. She kept coming back to the land. 43 acres. Most of it forested, which she had always thought meant it was valuable only for timber. But the Blackridge men had not looked like timber men. They had looked like the kind of men who had already looked at a map and made calculations. And when Harold had said no, they had looked at him with the particular patience of people who are confident the answer will eventually change. What if the land was worth not timber but something beneath it? She knew enough about the frontier economy to know that the difference between a piece of ground worth nothing and a piece worth a fortune was often something you couldn't see from the surface. Coal, ice, and silver. The possibilities that made men travel across the country and send lawyers and hire quiet men in dark coats to stand on street corners and watch widows. She stitched 2 more inches of the bodice and then stopped. Eliza, she said, do you know if there's anyone in this area who worked in surveying? Land assessment. Someone who would understand what makes a piece of ground valuable beyond what shows on the surface. Eliza looked up from the dress she was fitting. For what you're thinking, you'd want Tom Aldred. He did survey work in the territories for about 15 years before his hip gave out. Lives about 4 miles north now. Does he talk to people? He talks to anyone who comes with coffee and doesn't expect him to stand up for it. Tom Aldred was 73, shaped like a man who had spent decades in the field and was still fighting the stillness of retirement, and he received Mara at his kitchen table with the immediately assessing look of someone who had spent a career reading landscapes and had transferred that habit to people. She told him about the land. Not everything she left out Blackridge by name, left out the lawyers and the debt, described the property as accurately as she could from memory. The 43 acres, the creek through the lower third, the forested hills, the general location in western Pennsylvania. Tom was quiet for a moment after she finished. He had a worn map tacked to the wall beside the window, and he looked at it for a moment before he looked back at her. Western Pennsylvania, he said. You said there's a creek running through the lower third. Yes. What color is the rock where the creek runs? Not the pebbles in the water, the exposed rock on the banks. She thought about it. She had been to the land exactly twice, both times with Harold. Greenish. Blue-green in places. Tom nodded slowly, in the way of a man confirming something he already suspected. That's serpentine rock, he said. Or it could be. Can't say certain from a description. But serpentine rock in that region of Pennsylvania is associated with copper ore deposits. Sometimes tin, sometimes both. Mara sat very still. Significant amounts? She said. Could be. Could be trace amounts, too. You'd need a proper geological survey to know what you were dealing with. But if the rock is what I think it might be based on what you're telling me, and if the creek is running the right way, the property could be sitting on top of a mineral deposit that would make a mining company very interested. He paused, or very determined. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Thank you, she said. You want to be careful, Tom said, in the particular way of a man who had seen enough to mean it. Mineral rights in this territory are not a simple thing, and men who want them are not always patient. No, Mara said, they're not. She drove back to town with the cold in her face and the particular sensation of a puzzle piece fitting into a place that made the picture both clearer and more alarming. She found Wyatt at the livery, which was where he went when he needed to be somewhere practical. He was working on a piece of tack that needed repair, doing it himself rather than paying someone, which was consistent with everything she had come to understand about how he operated. She told him what Tom Aldred had said. He did not stop working on the tack while she talked, but the quality of his attention changed. She could see it in his hands, which slowed without stopping entirely. The way a person's body goes still when something they're hearing requires them to think. When she finished, he set the tack down. Copper and tin, he said. Possibly. He couldn't say for certain without a survey, but enough to explain why a mining company would make 2 offers and then start looking for leverage when they got turned down twice. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the livery had its usual sounds: horses shifting, the creak of wood, the wind against the walls. Outside, Silver Creek was doing its afternoon business without any apparent awareness that 2 people inside the livery were sitting at the center of something that was considerably bigger than a $400 debt. Who else knows about this land? Wyatt said. Back in Pennsylvania. Anyone Harold told? His brother, possibly. They weren't close. There may have been something in the probate records when Harold died, but I handled the estate myself, and I didn't file anything that named the land specifically as an asset. Why not? She hesitated. It was a short hesitation, but he noticed it. He always noticed. Because I didn't trust the process, she said. Harold had told me about the second visit from the Blackridge men, the way they'd looked at him. I was probably being careful to the point of paranoia, but I kept the land out of the estate filings, and I transferred the deed to my own name through a county clerk I drove 3 towns over to find. Wyatt looked at her. You drove 3 towns over, he said. I wanted someone who didn't know Harold, didn't know us, someone who would file the paperwork and forget about it. He was quiet for another moment. She could see him reassessing. Something could see him revising the picture he had of her, and she found that she did not mind being revised upward. She had grown tired of being underestimated and was at the point where she almost found it satisfying to let people discover their error. All right, he said. So the deed is in your name. That's good. But if they're coming after you through the debt, they may be arguing that Harold's estate is what actually owns the land, that the transfer to your name wasn't valid, because it happened after the debt existed. I thought of that. Then you need a lawyer, I know. Not one from Silver Creek. Helena, he said. There's a man named Vance. Elias Vance, he's honest, which in my experience is rarer in that profession than it should be, and he's handled federal land cases before. You know him? I knew his father. Sent him a letter 2 years ago when I had a boundary dispute with a neighbor. He sorted it in 2 months. He paused. I'll write to him. I can write to myself. I know you can. He picked up the tack again. I'll write to him because I know him and he'll respond faster. That's the only reason. She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the tack. There was something in the straightness of his back that told her the offer had cost him more than he was making it. Appear that it had involved some internal negotiation between the part of him that had spent 7 years keeping a careful distance from other people's problems, and the part that was, apparently, no longer able to maintain that distance where she was concerned. She did not point this out. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. We don't know what Vance will find. What Vance found in his initial response 2 weeks later was worse than either of them had hoped, and better than either of them had feared. The debt was documentable. Cornelius Fitch had been a real creditor, and the $412 was a real amount Harold had borrowed in 1881. The firm of Holt, Crane, and Mercer was real and legitimate. All of that was true. But Fitch's estate had been purchased along with the Ellison debt, specifically by an investment group 18 months ago. The investment group was called the Caraway Land Partners, and it was difficult to trace. But what Vance had been able to establish was that Caraway shared 3 of its 4 principals with a company called Blackridge Mining. He laid this out in a letter that was 3 pages long, careful and precise, and ended with the following observation. This is not a debt collection. This is a legal strategy designed to contest the validity of your property transfer, force the estate back into probate, and use the resulting legal confusion to file a competing claim on the land before the matter is resolved. I have seen this done before. It is effective against anyone who cannot afford sustained litigation. I recommend we move quickly. Mara read the letter 4 times at Wyatt's table, and each time she finished it, she felt the same thing. Not fear exactly, and not anger exactly, but a clear and steady recognition of the size of what she was dealing with. She had known it was large. She had not known how precisely engineered it was. They bought the debt, Wyatt said, yes, specifically to use it against me, which means someone told them you were here before they bought it. They knew where to send the letter because they already knew where to look. Mara nodded. Dorothea Hatch, he said. I don't know that for certain. No. But Hatch's grain business has interests in 3 counties, and he's had business connections to Eastern investment groups before. He stopped. I should have paid more attention to who he was talking to. You didn't know there was reason to. I should have generally paid more attention. He said it flatly. Not as self-flagellation, but as the honest assessment of a man who had spent 7 years deliberately not paying attention to things and was now understanding the cost of that habit. Mara looked at the letter again. Vance says we need to move quickly. How quickly? He wants to file a counterclaim before they can force the probate proceeding. If we file first, we set the terms of the dispute. If they file first, we're on the defensive, and they have the resources to sustain that position longer than I do. What does filing first require? My presence in Helena. My documents, Harold's original deed, the transfer paperwork, his records from the months before he died. She paused. And money. Vance's retainer is not small. Wyatt was quiet. I have some, she said. Not enough. He was still quiet. Wyatt, I'm thinking. I'm not asking you to pay for it. I know you're not. He looked at her. I have money put aside. From the trapping, it's not a fortune, but it's sufficient. No, Mara. I said no. She put the letter down on the table and met his eyes directly. I know what you're doing and I understand why, and I'm telling you no. This is my fight. I'm not going to let you spend your savings on my problem. It's not just your problem anymore, he said it simply, without drama, in the same tone he used for everything. Someone in this town has been feeding informations about you to a company that may have killed your husband. That makes it my problem too, not because you're... He stopped, and she could see him selecting words with unusual care. Not because of what we are to each other, because it's wrong. And because I'm the one who's been sitting here not paying attention while something built up around you that I could have noticed sooner. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching, which was the thing she had come to rely on about him. He did not look away from things that were uncomfortable. He did not soften them into easier shapes. He saw what was in front of him and said what it was. Split it, she said finally. What? We split the retainer. Half from me, half from you. I pay you back from the land proceeds when this is resolved. He thought about it for a moment, which was honest. He could have said yes immediately, and she would have known it was capitulation rather than agreement. The pause meant he was actually considering whether it was workable. All right, he said, split. The man in the dark coat had a name. She found it out through Paulette Marsh, who found it out through the registration book at the Silver Creek boarding house, which Paulette had access to because her cousin owned it. The man had registered as Silas Rook, listed his origin as Denver, and given no occupation, which was in itself a kind of occupation. Silas Rook had been in Silver Creek for 6 weeks, 2 weeks before Mara had first noticed him, and 4 weeks since. He had not made himself conspicuous, except to her, which meant he was good at his work, whatever that work was. He had paid his board in advance, in cash, and had told the house owner he was waiting on a business matter to conclude. When Mara heard the name, something in her chest went carefully still. She mentioned it to Wyatt that evening, and she watched his face do something it rarely did, a brief tightening around the jaw, quickly suppressed. You know that name, she said. I know of a Silas Rook, who worked as a process agent for a business interest out of Denver about 4 years ago, serving papers, sometimes watching properties before they went into foreclosure, the kind of work that doesn't go through courts. He paused. He had a reputation for not doing anything formally illegal, but making people understand that things could get uncomfortable. An intimidator, she said. A professional one. She thought about that for a moment, about the way he had watched her and not looked away, about the figure she had possibly seen in the dark near her gate. He hasn't done anything, she said. Not yet. He's waiting. For what? For me to be frightened enough to give up the land without the legal fight. If I file with Vance, it becomes expensive and visible for them. But if I decide it's not worth it and sign something agreeable, they get what they want without the exposure. Wyatt said nothing, but his expression said what he thought of that possibility. I'm not going to do that, she said. I know. I want to be clear about it. You are clear about it. He looked at the fire. Mara. What happened to Harold? Are you certain about what you think happened? She had not said it plainly before. She had implied it, circled it, presented the chronology without stating the conclusion. He was asking her to state it. No, she said. I'm not certain. He was not a young man. He had headaches that winter. The fever was real. She stopped. But the timing bothers me. 2 months after refusing their second offer, with a threatening letter in between. I cannot prove anything. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to prove anything. But you believe it. She looked at him. Yes, I believe it. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he had heard something he intended to act on. Outside the cabin, the wind had picked up again. It rattled the window in its frame, and the fire responded by pulling sharply, the flames bending toward the chimney. In Silver Creek, 2 miles away, a man named Silas Rook was sitting in a boarding house room that he had paid for in advance, waiting on a business matter to conclude. Mara was going to make sure it concluded differently than he expected. She picked up her coat and her gloves and gathered the things she needed to take back to her room, and at the door she paused. "Write to Vance tonight," she said. "Tell him we're coming." Wyatt looked up from the fire. "Both of us," he said. "Both of us," she said. "I don't need you to fight my battles. But I've decided I don't have to fight them alone if I don't want to, and I don't want to." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "Both of us." She pulled the door open against the cold and went out into the dark Montana night, the wind hitting her face, her breath visible in the air. Behind her, the cabin window glowed. Ahead of her was the road back to Silver Creek, and whatever Silas Rook was waiting to see, and the long work of fighting something much larger and better funded than herself. She had done harder things. She was not entirely sure what they were at the moment, but she was confident they existed, and she walked toward town with that confidence and with the cold, and with the steady understanding that the next move was hers. Wyatt's letter reached Elias Vance in Helena on a Thursday, and Vance's reply came back 8 days later, which was fast enough to tell Mara that Wyatt had not exaggerated when he said the man moved quickly when the matter warranted it. The reply was 2 pages. The first page covered what Vance had already told them: the Caraway connection, the engineered debt, the timeline of the legal strategy being assembled against her. The second page was new, and it was the page that made Mara sit down at Wyatt's table and stay sitting for a long time without speaking. Vance had found 3 other cases, 3 other property owners in different territories, one in Wyoming, one in Colorado, one in the Dakota Territory, who had been approached by Black Ridge Mining, had refused, and had subsequently found themselves facing legal challenges to their land titles through what appeared, in each instance, to be unrelated creditors. In the Wyoming case, the owner had fought for 14 months before the legal costs consumed him, and he surrendered the property at a price well below its surveyed value. In Colorado, the owner had died during the dispute, a riding accident, ruled accidental, and the estate had settled quickly. In the Dakota case, the matter was still unresolved, but the owner had not been seen publicly in 2 months, and his lawyer had stopped filing responses. She read the Dakota paragraph again. Then she looked up at Wyatt, who had been standing at the window since she started reading, watching the road with the patient attention of a man who has decided he is going to watch a thing and is not going to stop. "Silas Rook is still out there," he said, without turning around. Yes, she set the letter down. Vance found 3 other cases. He turned then. She told him what the second page said. She did not soften it or rearrange it into something easier. She told him the Wyoming owner had lost. She told him about the Colorado riding accident. She told him about the Dakota man who had stopped being visible. Wyatt's jaw was doing the thing it did when he was angry, and not planning to express the anger until it had been processed into something more useful. She had learned to recognize this. It looked from the outside like stillness, but it was actually its opposite. "Harold," he said. "Harold," she said. The word sat between them. It was not a question, and it was not a statement. It was a recognition. "Vance needs to know about the fever," Wyatt said. "He needs to know the sequence. The visits, the letters, the timing. I know. I've been deciding how much to put in writing." She looked at the letter on the table. "If I send Vance a document that says I believe my husband was killed by a mining company, and that document becomes part of a legal proceeding, it can be turned around and used to make me look unstable. Grieving widow constructing conspiracy from coincidence. I've seen how that works. So you don't put it in writing. I tell him in person. When we get to Helena." Wyatt nodded. He looked at the road again through the window. "We need to leave within the week. The roads will be difficult. It's been snowing in the high country." "I know, Wyatt." She said his name in the tone she used when she needed him to look at her, and he was doing the thing where he looked at everything except the thing directly in front of him. He turned. "I'm not asking you to manage the logistics. I am capable of preparing for a winter road journey. I know you are. Then stop planning it without me." He looked at her for a moment. "Then I bought a second set of cold weather gear from the outfitter yesterday, in your approximate size, which I guessed at and may have gotten wrong. I wasn't planning without you. I was getting materials." She looked at him. "You guessed at my size," she said. "I've seen you in your coat enough times," he said it without apology or awkwardness. "If it doesn't fit, we can exchange it." She did not know what to do with Wyatt Mercer when he did things like this, things that were practical and unsentimental on the surface, but which required him to have paid a particular quality of attention to her, and to have acted on it without being asked, and to then present it as simple logistics. She had known men who were kind in elaborate, performed ways, and she had known men who were not kind at all, and she had not previously encountered this specific variety which appeared to be kindness operating entirely without announcement. "Thank you," she said. "If it doesn't fit, I heard you. We'll exchange it if we need to." She went back to her rented room that afternoon and began the work of organizing what she had. The documents were in a flat leather satchel she had bought specifically for the purpose of keeping them together, and she had kept it under the floorboard beneath her bed since the first week she arrived in Silver Creek, not because she had known then that any of this would happen, but because she was a woman who understood that important papers needed a place that was not obvious, and that instinct had turned out to be worth more than she could have predicted. She took the satchel out and laid everything on the bed. Harold's original deed to the Pennsylvania land, inherited from his uncle, dated 1877. The 2 letters from Blackridge Mining, both offers, both declined. Harold had kept them. She had found them in his desk after he died, and understood immediately that she should not leave them in the house. The threatening letter unsigned, typed on plain paper, delivered to the house 3 weeks before Harold's fever started. She had not been certain it was a threat when it arrived, but she had kept it because something about the specific phrasings of certain sentences had made her uncomfortable. Now, reading it again after everything Vance had told her, the phrasing was unmistakable. It was not a threat by any legal definition she could articulate it. It was simply a letter that described, in precise and careful language, how unfortunate it would be if the property situation remained unresolved, and how much simpler everything would become if the matter were settled to mutual satisfaction. The kind of letter written by someone who understood exactly where the line was. She had the transfer deed, the one she'd had filed 3 towns away, by the clerk, who didn't know them. She had Harold's personal account books from the 2 years before his death, which contained, in his cramped and slightly chaotic handwriting, entries that documented the timing of the Blackridge visits, his own notes about the conversations, his concerns written out in the shorthand way he had of recording things that mattered to him. She spread it all out and looked at it. It was enough. She thought it was enough. It was a story that told itself if you laid the pieces in order: the land, the offers, the refusals, the threats, the timing of the fever, the debt conveniently purchased and deployed 18 months later. It was not proof of the worst of what she suspected, but it was a clear and documentable record of a pattern, and Vance had 3 other cases to set beside it, and together they made a shape that was harder to dismiss. She repacked the satchel carefully, in the order she would need to present things, and put it back under the floorboard. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and thought about Harold. She did not do this often, not in a deliberate way. The grief was not the acute, suffocating kind anymore. It had settled into something more like a permanent, low-grade condition, the way an old injury makes itself felt in certain weather. She missed him in specific, granular ways: the sound of him moving around in the kitchen early in the morning, his habit of reading aloud from newspapers as though she were also interested in every story he encountered, the way he had always reached for her hand when he was worried about something, rather than trying to appear not worried. He had not been perfect. He had kept things from her: the Blackridge visits, at first the threatening letter, for 3 days before he showed it to her, the full extent of the debt to Fitch, which she had not discovered until after his death. He had kept things from her because he was the kind of man who processed worry privately, who did not want to alarm her, who operated on the theory that if he could solve a problem himself he should, and if he couldn't, he would figure that out before involving her. She had been angry at him for it after. Angry at him in the specific, helpless way you can be angry at someone who is no longer there to defend themselves, which is one of the crueler features of grief. But she understood it, too. And she was here now with his papers in a satchel under her floorboard, doing what he had not managed to do, fighting the thing that had. She believed with a certainty she could not prove, killed him. She was going to win. She had decided this in the same clear, unsentimental way she decided most things, and she intended to hold it. 3 days before they were meant to leave for Helena, Silas Rook approached her directly. She was coming out of the mercantile, managing 2 paper parcels and her own coat against the wind, and he was simply there, standing 4 feet away, positioned so that she would have had to actively walk around him to avoid him, which would have required her to acknowledge she was avoiding him, which she was not willing to do. She stopped. She looked at him. Up close, he was more ordinary than she had expected. Medium height, medium build, the kind of face that was designed to be forgotten, no strong features. Nothing you would describe afterward with any confidence. His eyes were the exception. They were a pale, flat gray, and they looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive exactly, but was absolutely intentional. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said. "My name is Silas Rook. I know who you are." She shifted one of the parcels. "What do you want?" He seemed to recalibrate slightly. She could see it. A small adjustment in his expression that told her he had expected either more nervousness or more aggression, and she had given him neither. "I represent certain interests that have been trying to resolve a straightforward inheritance matter with you," he said. "It seems the legal correspondence hasn't produced a productive conversation. and I was hoping we might speak more directly. The legal correspondence produced a very productive conversation, she said. Just not the one your employers intended. Another small adjustment in his expression. Mrs. Ellison, you're in a difficult position. The debt is real. The legal exposure to your property is real. The men I represent are prepared to be generous to retire the debt entirely, in exchange for a straightforward conveyance of the Pennsylvania parcel. The parcel you've been trying to take through a court proceeding, a proceeding that could be avoided entirely, to my benefit or yours. He looked at her with those flat gray eyes, both ideally. She looked back at him for a moment. She was aware of the wind, of the cold, of the people moving on the boardwalk around them, a few of them glancing over, the way people glance at things that have an unusual quality of stillness in a moving environment. Tell me something, she said. The man in Wyoming who had similar land. Did he find your offer generous? Something crossed his face too fast to name fully, but she caught the edges of it. It was the involuntary expression of someone who has heard a reference they did not expect. And for just a moment, it told her everything she needed to know about whether Vance's 3 cases were connected to the man standing in front of her. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. I think you do. She picked up her parcels more securely. I'm not going to take the offer, Mr. Rook. I'm not going to take any offer you present to me, because I don't negotiate with people whose employers may have had a hand in my husband's death. That's my position, and it's not going to change. She walked around him and kept going. She made it half a block before her hands started shaking inside their gloves, not from fear, but from the sustained effort of appearing entirely steady when every nerve in her body had been firing at once. She went directly to Eliza Greer's shop and let herself in the back door and sat down on the stool beside the cutting table and breathed. Eliza looked at her face and poured tea without asking any questions. I spoke to him, Mara said. Rook? He made an offer. In the street. Direct. What did you say? I said no. She wrapped her hands around the teacup. I may have also implied that I know about the Wyoming case. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Was that wise? Probably not, Mara thought about it. But I needed him to know that I am not operating in the dark, that I have information, that walking away from this fight would be a strategic decision on my part, not a panicked one. And if telling him that makes his employers more aggressive, they were always going to be aggressive. The question was whether I was going to meet that from a position of appearing frightened or a position of appearing to know exactly what I'm dealing with. She drank the tea. I chose the second. Eliza looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she reserved for things she found both admirable and alarming. When do you leave? 3 days. Then you need to be careful for 3 days. I know, not just you. Eliza set down her own cup. Wyatt, too. If they think he's involved, he is involved. Which means he's also at risk. Mara had thought about this. She had thought about it at length and from multiple angles, and she had arrived at the same conclusion each time, which was that she could not protect Wyatt Mercer from risks he had chosen to accept with full knowledge of what they were. He was not a man who could be managed into safety. He was a man who had weighed the situation and made a decision, and the most respectful thing she could do with that was not to undermine it by trying to carry the danger alone. I know, she said again, and meant it differently this time. That evening she went to his cabin and told him about the encounter with Rook. She told him all of it, including the part about the shaking hands, which she would not have told most people, but which she told him because she had arrived at some point she couldn't precisely locate, at which the performance of being entirely together in front of Wyatt Mercer had stopped feeling necessary. He listened. He did not react to the shaking hands part with anything she would have called pity, which was the response she had been prepared to navigate. He simply added it to the rest of the information. He went to you directly, Wyatt said, which means they've decided the legal route is taking too long or is too risky with Vance involved. They're trying to get a settlement before the counterclaim is filed. Yes. And you told him you knew about Wyoming. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then that was a risk. I know. But it might also make them hesitate. If they know you've been talking to someone who connected their cases, there's exposure they didn't plan for. That's what I was hoping. Or it accelerates things. I know that too. She looked at him directly. I made a call in the moment. I think was right. I can't know for certain, he nodded. He did not second-guess it further, which was something she had come to appreciate about him. He would name a risk. He would sit with it briefly. And then he would accept that a decision had been made and move forward from there. He did not relitigate. I want to move the departure up, he said. Leave day after tomorrow instead of 3 days. The gear from the outfitter is already packed. I've had it ready since yesterday. She looked at him. I was going to suggest moving up tomorrow morning, he said, with the particular flatness of a man who is not explaining himself, because he doesn't think explanation is necessary. But I wanted to tell you first. She thought about what needed to be done before she left. The satchel under the floorboard. A note to Eliza. The letter to Vance telling him to expect them. Her room she paid week to week. She would need to leave something with the landlord. Tomorrow morning, she said, I can be ready. He nodded. Mara! He said her name in the way that meant he was going to say something he had been working up to. She waited. When we get to Helena, let Vance handle the legal parts. I know that's not how you prefer to operate. But he knows the territory, and he knows the people, and I know how to work with a lawyer, Wyatt. I know you do. I'm asking you to trust this one more than you're inclined to trust anyone. She looked at him. That's fair, she said, after a moment. That's a fair thing to ask. He looked faintly surprised, which meant he had been braced for more resistance, which made her feel briefly and fondly exasperated. I'm not unreasonable, she said. I know that. You looked surprised. I looked, he stopped. I'll have the horses ready at first light. They left before dawn, which was cold in the specific Montana way that gets into the spaces between your layers and stays there. Mara had the satchel in her saddlebag, positioned so she could feel its weight against her leg. She had given Eliza a sealed letter to hold for 14 days if Mara had not contacted her by then. Eliza was to open it and do what the letter asked. She had not explained this to Eliza, who had taken the letter without asking for an explanation and held Mara's hands briefly before she left. The road to Helena in winter was not the road to Helena in any other season. It moved through 3 mountain passes, 2 of which had already taken on serious snow, and the pace it required was conservative in a way that ate the hours. Wyatt knew the road well and set the pace without comment, and she followed it. They did not talk much in the early hours. This was not unusual for them. They had built a companionship over 4 months that was comfortable with silence, that did not require constant maintenance through conversation. But the quality of the silence on the road was different from the quality of it in his cabin or at Eliza's shop. It was a traveling silence, the kind that moves alongside things rather than sitting with them. Around mid-morning, at a point where the road came through a narrow cut in the rock, and then opened onto a long downhill slope with a view of the valley below, Wyatt pulled up and she came alongside him. He was looking back up the road. She looked too. The road behind them was empty as far as she could see. Someone followed us out of town, he said. She kept her voice level. You're certain? No, but there was a rider about a quarter-mile back when we came through the last bend. He stopped when we stopped, which is the kind of decision a person makes when they don't want to be seen stopping. Rook? Don't know. Could be someone he hired. He looked at the valley below. We have 2 choices. We keep the same pace and act like we haven't noticed, or we change something. If we change something, they know we've noticed. If we don't, they know exactly where we're going and at what speed, Mara thought. They already know we're going to Helena. Rook knows there's no advantage in pretending otherwise. Then we stop pretending. He turned his horse and looked back up the road. She waited. A moment later, a figure appeared at the bend, a rider, who did indeed stop when he saw them stopped, which was confirmation enough. Wyatt raised one hand in the flat, deliberate wave of a man who has seen a thing and wants the thing to know it has been seen. The rider, after a pause, turned his horse and went back the way he had come. Wyatt watched until he was gone. What does that accomplish? Mara said. It tells them we're not operating blind. They go back and tell Rook or whoever hired them that we knew we were being followed. It slows their planning because now they have to account for the possibility that we're further ahead than they assumed. He turned back down the road. Also, it felt necessary. She looked at him. That last part, he said, is not strategic. No, she agreed, but I understand it. They reached a way station at nightfall, a rough establishment that provided beds, a fire, and food of indeterminate composition that was nevertheless hot. The proprietor was a man named Dull, who asked no questions, which was either because he had learned that his clientele preferred it, or because he simply had no curiosity. Mara could not tell which, and decided it didn't matter. She sat by the fire after dinner with her satchel on her lap, not opening it, just feeling the weight of it. Wyatt sat across from her with a cup of the establishment's coffee, which was very bad but served its function. Tell me about Harold, he said. She looked at him. It was not what she had expected him to say, and the unexpectedness of it caught her for a moment. What do you want to know? Whatever you want to tell me. He held the cup in both hands. You've told me the events, the visits, the fever, the letter. But I don't know what kind of man he was, and I think I should, if we're going to stand up in Helena and fight for what his choices cost him. She thought about where to start, and started in the middle, the way she always did with things that mattered. He was generous to a fault, she said. He gave money to people who he shouldn't have trusted, including probably Fitch, and he never asked for it back even when they didn't return it. He thought better of people than they deserved, consistently. She paused. He was also stubborn about certain things. The land was one of them. Once he decided that the Blackridge offer was too low, and that the men making it didn't deserve his trust, nothing was going to move him. I think that's partly why he didn't tell me about the threatening letter immediately, because he knew that if he told me, I would want us to talk to someone official, and talking to someone official would feel like admitting they'd frightened him, and he wasn't going to give them that. Was he right to refuse? She thought about it seriously. To refuse their offer? Yes, I think so. The land was worth more than what they offered, and even if we'd never found out why, refusing on principle wasn't wrong. She looked at the fire. To keep the threatening letter from me for 3 days? No. That was the stubbornness working against us. If he'd shown it to me the day it arrived, we might have moved differently. I don't know if it would have changed the outcome, but we would have had more time. He was trying to protect you. I know, I understand why. Doesn't mean it was right. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time she had heard him say his wife's name. She went still and listened carefully. Eleanor used to tell me I managed things wrong from the beginning, that I would decide something was my problem and then carry it alone until it was too far gone to fix easily. And then I'd tell her about it, and she'd be angry not because I'd made a mistake, but because I hadn't let her help me make fewer of them. He looked at the fire. She was right about that. Mara said nothing. She understood that what he was giving her was not exactly comfort and not exactly confession. It was something more like acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who had recognized in Harold's pattern something he knew from his own, and who was using it to tell her, sideways and without making it sentimental, that he understood why she was angry and also why she had loved him anyway. He would have liked you, she said after a moment. Wyatt looked faintly skeptical. He would have, she said. He respected people who said what they meant. He didn't have much patience for performance. She almost smiled. He would have driven you slightly mad within about 4 days, because he talked constantly and you don't, but he would have liked you. Something moved across Wyatt's face that was not quite a smile, but was the shape of one. 4 days, he said, possibly 3. He drank the rest of his bad coffee. She shifted the satchel on her lap. Outside the way station, the wind had the high, thin sound it made when the temperature was dropping hard, and inside the fire cracked and worked. They reached Helena on the 4th day, coming in from the north, on a road that was half frozen mud and half packed snow, the horses tired and careful with their footing. Helena was bigger than Silver Creek, by a factor that always surprised Mara slightly when she saw it. She had spent enough time in Silver Creek that its scale had started to feel normal, and the streets of Helena, with their 3-story buildings, and their volume of people and wagons, and the general productive noise of a territorial capital, reminded her of Pennsylvania in ways that were not entirely comfortable. Elias Vance had his office on the 2nd floor of a building on Last Chance Gulch, which was the main commercial street, and which had been named, with a directness Mara appreciated, for the circumstances under which gold had been discovered there. She and Wyatt left the horses at a livery and went up the stairs. Vance was younger than she had expected. Not young exactly, somewhere in his mid-30s, but younger than his correspondence had suggested, which had the somewhat impersonal precision of a man twice his age. He was compact, dark-haired, and shook her hand when she came in with the automatic firmness of someone who had made a decision early in his career not to adjust his handshake for women. She liked him immediately, which she noted as useful information. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Mercer." He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "I'm glad you're here. The timeline has moved." She sat. "What happened?" "Caraway filed in the territorial court 3 days ago. They moved faster than I anticipated. They must have gotten word that I was involved and decided to preempt the counterclaim." He sat behind his desk and opened a folder. "They've filed an action to reopen Harold Ellison's estate on the grounds that the Pennsylvania property was not properly included in the original probate. If the court accepts that argument, the property reverts to the estate, which Caraway then claims against using the Fitch debt. Can they do that? They can try. The question is whether the court accepts their framing of the original probate as deficient. That's where your transfer deed becomes critical if we can establish that the transfer to your name was executed before any claim was filed, and that it was executed with proper documentation. We have a strong argument that there's no estate interest to reopen. I have the deed, I have the original, and I have the filing receipt from the county clerk." Vance looked at her, the clerk who filed it. 3 towns from where we lived. Someone who didn't know us. He nodded slowly. "That was very smart of you, Mrs. Ellison. I had reason to be careful." She opened the satchel and began laying documents on his desk, in the order she had organized them: the original deed, the transfer, the receipt, the Blackridge letters, the threatening note, Harold's account books, open to the relevant pages. She watched Vance's face as he worked through them, and she watched the specific quality of his attention change when he reached the threatening letter and then the account book entries. He read the account book page twice. He documented the dates of the visits, Vance said. He documented everything. It was a habit. It drove me mad when he was alive. She heard the past tense land in the room. He wrote down dates and conversations and what he'd spent money on and what the weather was. I found these after he died, and I understood for the first time why he'd always done it. Vance set the account book down carefully. Mrs. Ellison, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to tell me honestly, not diplomatically. Go ahead. Do you believe your husband's death was connected to his refusal to sell this property? She had been waiting for this question. She had been deciding all the way from Silver Creek exactly how to answer it, how much to say it, how to present her conviction, without making it sound like the projection of a grieving woman. She said, I believe the sequence of events is too specific to be coincidence. I believe that the Blackridge Company, or people acting in its interest, had both the motive and the demonstrated willingness based on what you found in Wyoming and Colorado and Dakota to take actions that removed obstacles to their acquisitions. I believe Harold was an obstacle, and I believe he was removed. She paused. I cannot prove it, I know that. I'm not asking you to build a legal case around it. I'm telling you what I believe so that you understand the full picture. Vance looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt, who had been sitting in the other chair, with his arms folded and his expression neutral throughout. Mr. Mercer, he said, do you share her assessment? I share her assessment, Wyatt said. And I've spent 7 years in the mountains, reading weather and terrain, and I know the difference between a pattern and a coincidence. This is a pattern. Vance looked back at his folder. All right, he said. Then we need to move today. I'm going to file the counterclaim this afternoon. I have it drafted. I've been waiting for you to confirm the documentation. I'm also going to contact the Federal Land Office. What Mrs. Ellison has brought me, combined with the 3 cases I've already documented, is enough to open a federal inquiry into Blackridge's acquisition practices. That inquiry, if it proceeds, changes the pressure equation significantly. How so, Mara said. Because federal scrutiny is public scrutiny. Blackridge can manage a territorial court case. They have money and connections, and they can sustain litigation. What they cannot as easily manage is a federal investigation that makes the newspapers and draws attention to the pattern across multiple territories. Their strategy depends on each case appearing isolated. If someone establishes that they're not isolated, the strategy falls apart. He looked at her. Your documents make that argument. The account book alone, the dates, the language, the timeline is remarkable. He documented everything, she said again. He did you an extraordinary service. She looked at the account book on Vance's desk, Harold's handwriting visible across the open page, cramped and slightly sideways the way it always had been, the exact same handwriting she had been looking at across breakfast tables for 11 years, and she felt something move through her chest that was not grief and not relief, but something partway between the two, the particular feeling of a person who realizes that someone they loved gave them, without knowing it, exactly what they would need. She did not let it show on her face. There was too much work to do. File the counterclaim, she said. Today Vance was already reaching for his pen. The counterclaim was filed that afternoon at the territorial court. Vance moved through the courthouse with the efficiency of a man who knew every clerk by name and had learned which lines to stand in, and Mara stood beside him at the counter while the papers were stamped and logged, and she felt the particular solidity of a thing being made official of her name, and her claim existing in a record that could not be casually erased. But the afternoon brought something she had not anticipated. Vance met them back at his office with an expression that had changed in quality since the courthouse still controlled, but with an edge of something she would call concern. There's a problem, he said. She sat down without being asked. Tell me. I made inquiries while you were waiting for the filing to process. Blackridge has a representative in Helena. He paused. A man named Augustus Vale. He arrived last week. Who is he? The company's senior representative for territorial acquisitions. The fact that he's here personally, rather than operating through lawyers, suggests they're treating this as a higher priority matter than a standard land dispute. He sat down behind his desk. He's requested a meeting with Judge Harlan Price tomorrow morning. Wyatt leaned forward. Who is Price? He sits on the territorial bench and he handles mineral rights cases. He's also known to have, Vance chose his next words carefully, relationships with certain commercial interests that he does not always fully disclose in the proceedings he presides over. The room was quiet for a moment. Vale is going to ask Price to fast-track the Caraway probate action, Mara said. That's my suspicion. Before your counterclaim can be heard. Before any response can be organized, yes. She looked at the wall behind Vance's desk where he had pinned a large territorial map. She looked at it without seeing it, running through what she knew and what she needed and what she had. Can you get the federal inquiry started before tomorrow morning, she said. Vance looked at her, then at the clock on his shelf. I can send a telegram tonight, he said slowly. If the Federal Land Office has a representative in the territory, do they? There's a deputy commissioner in Butte. We've corresponded. He takes the integrity of land records seriously. Then send the telegram tonight, before Vale sits down with Price tomorrow. Because if there's a federal inquiry in motion when that meeting happens, anything Price does in that meeting becomes more complicated, and complicated is what we need. Vance looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not yet seen on him, not surprise, exactly, but a recalibration. The same kind she had seen from others when she said something that moved faster or further than they'd expected. "You've been thinking about this longer than today," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the first letter arrived," she said. "I've had time." He picked up his pen. "I'll send the telegram tonight." Outside, Helena moved through its evening business, the streets loud with wagons and voices. Inside the office, the lamp burned steadily, and the map on the wall showed all the country between Silver Creek and Pennsylvania, all the distance she had traveled and the further distance she still had to go. But the counterclaim was filed, her name was in the record. Her husband's account book was in Vance's safe, and tomorrow, whatever Augustus Vale planned to accomplish in that meeting with Judge Price, he was going to find it more complicated than he had designed. She was counting on that. Vance sent the telegram that night from the Helena telegraph office, standing at the counter in his coat with Wyatt beside him, while the operator tapped out the message to Deputy Commissioner Roland Fitch, no relation, as far as anyone knew, to the creditor whose debt had started all of this in Butte. The message was careful and specific: federal land acquisition irregularities across multiple territories, documented pattern, supporting evidence available, requesting immediate inquiry authorization. Vance had written it out twice before he was satisfied with the phrasing, because he understood that how a thing was framed in its first moment of official existence shaped everything that came after. The operator sent it. They waited. 20 minutes later, the reply came back in the clipped, abbreviated language of telegraph communication. But its meaning was unambiguous: inquiry authorized. Send documentation. Will contact Territorial Court Clerk directly regarding pending proceedings. R. Fitch, Deputy Commissioner, Federal Land Office. Vance folded the reply and put it in his coat pocket. "That's what we needed," he said. Wyatt looked at him. "Will it hold? It's a federal authorization. Price can still meet with Vale tomorrow morning. I can't stop that. But anything he agrees to in that meeting now sits underneath federal scrutiny. If he fast-tracks the Caraway action knowing there's an active federal inquiry, he's made a very public choice that will follow him." He paused. "Price is corrupt in the particular way of men who are careful about it. He doesn't take obvious risks. This makes meeting with Vale tomorrow a much more obvious risk than it was yesterday." They went back to the boarding house where Mara was waiting. She was sitting at the small table in the room. She and Wyatt had taken 2 rooms, adjacent, a compromise that the boarding house's limited availability had imposed, and that neither of them had commented on, with Harold's account book open in front of her, not reading it, just sitting with it. She looked up when they came in. Wyatt told her about the telegram. He told it plainly, without inflation, the way he told everything. She listened, and when he was done, she looked at Vance. "What time is Vale's meeting with Price?" she said. 9 in the morning, from what I was told. "And we can't be in that meeting." "No. It's a private consultation, technically informal, which is how these things are arranged, when they're not meant to leave a record." She thought for a moment. "But Vale doesn't know about the federal inquiry yet. Not unless someone told him tonight. Then tomorrow morning before 9, I want to speak with Vale directly." Both men looked at her. Mara Wyatt started. "I heard what you're about to say," she said without sharpness. "And I'm not suggesting anything reckless. I'm suggesting that the federal inquiry changes our leverage, and Vale needs to understand the shape of what he's walking into before he sits down with Price and commits both of them to a strategy that is now considerably more dangerous than it was when they planned it. If he knows about the inquiry before the Price meeting," Vance said slowly, "he may decide the meeting is a liability rather than an asset, which means he pulls back from the judicial angle entirely, which is what we want." Vance looked at the account book on the table, at the window, at the wall, at his own hands. He was running the logic through. She watched him run it and did not rush him, because she had learned that he was a man who needed to complete his own thinking before he could commit, and that rushing him produced resistance rather than agreement. "The risk," he said finally, "is that Vale takes the warning as confirmation that we're worried, that we're trying to prevent the Price meeting because we don't think our counterclaim is strong enough to survive a fast-tracked proceeding. Then we make sure the warning doesn't read as worry," she said. "It needs to read as information, as a professional courtesy from someone who has no reason to be frightened, to a man who is about to make a mistake he'll regret." Another silence. "Can you do that?" Vance said. "Deliver it that way?" "I've been doing it that way since a man named Silas Rook tried to intimidate me on a street in Silver Creek," she said. "Yes, I can do that. Wyatt had been quiet throughout this exchange, and she was aware of him, aware of his stillness, which she had learned to read as a form of active attention rather than withdrawal. She looked at him. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "Do you? You're thinking you should be the one to speak to Vale." The thought crossed my mind. "And you understand why it shouldn't be you." He held her gaze for a moment. The thing she appreciated about him was that he didn't argue past the point where the argument was already decided. He could see what she was seeing, that a woman who appeared frightened was confirmation to men like Vale that the pressure was working, while a woman who appeared entirely steady was a different problem, a harder one, the kind that required recalculation. And Wyatt Mercer showing up in Vale's face would read as aggression that could be documented, managed, possibly used against them. Mara showing up with information and no visible emotion was something else. "All right," he said, "but I'll be nearby." She did not argue with that. Augustus Vale was staying at the Montana Hotel, which was the best establishment in Helena, and was therefore where a man who wanted people to understand his company's resources would stay. Mara arrived at 8 in the morning, which was early enough to catch him before any final preparations for the price meeting, and late enough that he would have eaten and dressed and be in the alert, confident state of a man who believes his day is organized. She asked for him at the front desk with the particular directness she had developed over the past several weeks, not aggressive, not deferential, simply a woman who expected to be taken seriously and had stopped providing people with the option of deciding otherwise. The desk clerk sent a boy up, and 5 minutes later she was directed to a small parlor off the main lobby. Vale was not what she had pictured. She had built a mental image from the architecture of what he represented, the kind of man who used mining companies the way other men used weapons, and she had expected something harder, more obviously calculated. Instead, he was somewhere in his early 50s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with a broad, open face that would have read as friendly in another context. He had the particular grooming of a man who had spent a career meeting people and understood that first impressions were infrastructure. He looked at her with the assessing quality of someone who was rapidly revising a prior expectation. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. He did not stand, which was a choice. She sat down across from him without being invited to, which was also a choice. "Mr. Vale," she said. "I'll keep this brief because I know you have a 9 o'clock appointment, and what I need to tell you is actually quite simple." Something shifted in his expression, a careful rearrangement that suggested the mention of the appointment had registered with more impact than he wanted to show. "I'm not aware of any appointment that's relevant to your situation," he said. "I'm sure you're not," she said pleasantly. "I'm also sure that the Deputy Commissioner of the Federal Land Office in Butte, who authorized a multi-territory inquiry into Black Ridge Mining's acquisition practices last evening, has already made contact with the territorial court clerk here in Helena regarding any pending proceedings related to the matter. I mention this not to concern you, but because I thought you would want to have accurate information before any meetings you may have today." The open face closed slightly. Just slightly, but she caught it. "Federal inquiry," he said. "Authorized last evening. I have the telegraph confirmation." She did not produce it, she didn't need to. The fact that she described it with that specific, boring precision was enough. "Our attorney filed a counterclaim with the territorial court yesterday afternoon as well. Both actions are now on record, Mrs. Ellison." He shifted in his chair, not nervously, but with the deliberateness of a man repositioning for a different conversation than the one he had prepared. "I want to be clear that Black Ridge Mining has no interest in creating difficulty for you personally. The Caraway matter is a straightforward debt collection that—" "Mr. Vale," she said it quietly. Not loudly, quietly was more effective, and she knew it. "I have my husband's documentation of 2 visits from your company's representatives in 1882, their offers, his refusals, and a threatening letter that arrived 6 weeks before he died of a sudden fever. I have a pattern of similar events across 3 other territories documented by our attorney. I have a federal inquiry that is now examining all of it." She paused. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because the information I've just given you changes the cost calculation of anything you plan to accomplish this morning, and I thought you should have it before you made decisions that cannot easily be undone." Silence. Vale looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who has encountered a situation that does not match his preparation, and who is deciding in real time what to do with that. "You drove 4 days from Silver Creek in winter," he said finally. "Yes. And before that, you organized a federal contact and filed a counterclaim in a territorial court." "Yes, you are not," he stopped. Started again. "You are not what Rook's reports described." She felt something move through her at the mention of Rook, not surprise, because she had known he was reporting to someone, but a specific satisfaction at having it confirmed this plainly. "No," she said, "I'm not." She stood up, she put her coat on. She left the parlor without looking back. because looking back would have been its own kind of message, and the message she had already delivered was sufficient. Outside the Montana hotel, the morning was bright and extremely cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel like it had edges. Wyatt was across the street, leaning against the wall of the hardware store with his arms folded and his hat pulled down, looking at nothing in particular in the way of a man who is looking at everything. She crossed the street. "How did it go?" he said. "He knows about the federal inquiry. He knows about the counterclaim. He knows Rook's assessment of me was inaccurate." She pulled her coat tighter. "Whether he cancels the price meeting is his decision, but he's making it now with correct information. Did he threaten you?" "No. He was too surprised to threaten me." She looked up the street toward the courthouse. "Let's go find Vance." They walked. The Helena streets were busy for early morning, the particular productive bustle of a territorial capital, with things to accomplish before the cold got serious. She walked beside Wyatt, not close enough to be conspicuous, and thought about Vale's face when she'd said federal inquiry, the specific quality of that small closure, that slight repositioning, the way a man looks when a calculation he was confident in has just become unreliable. "You're satisfied," Wyatt said. He was not asking. "I'm cautious," she said. "Satisfied is for when it's finished." But yes, a little." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same general space. Vance was at his office when they arrived, and he had news. The territorial court clerk had received a communication from the federal land office early that morning. Fitch's office had moved faster than any of them had expected, contacting not just the clerk but the presiding court administrator directly. The Caraway probate action had been flagged as potentially subject to federal jurisdiction review, which meant it could not be fast-tracked by any territorial judge without risking a federal preemption. "Price can still meet with Vale," Vance said, "but there's nothing he can do for them in that meeting that won't immediately attract federal attention. Which means the meeting, if it happens at all, is now just two men talking." He set the court clerk's note on his desk. "We've effectively removed the judicial shortcut they were counting on." Mara sat down. The relief was there, she could feel it, but she held it at arm's length because she had learned over that the thing you feel as relief is often premature, and she was not done. "The counterclaim," she said. "What's its current status?" "Filed and logged. The court has 30 days to set a hearing date. Given the federal inquiry running parallel, they'll move carefully." He looked at his papers. "Mrs. Ellison, what you brought me Harold's account book, the Blackridge letters, the threatening note, I want to submit these as supporting documentation with the federal office, not as accusations, as a documented timeline that informs their inquiry into the acquisition pattern." "Will my name be on that submission?" "Necessarily, yes. You're the source." She thought about that, about what it meant to have her name formally attached to a document that accused even indirectly, even by implication, a mining company of behavior that had contributed to her husband's death. It was not a comfortable thing, but it was the kind of discomfort that came from doing what was necessary rather than what was easy. And she had stopped confusing the two a long time ago. "Submit them," she said. Vance nodded. "There's one more thing I should tell you, and it's complicated." She looked at him. "Silas Rook is in Helena." The room went quiet. She heard Wyatt shift in his chair. "Since when?" Wyatt said. "He arrived yesterday. From what the boarding house records show, I had someone check." Vance looked at Mara. "I don't know if this was planned before you left Silver Creek, or if he followed you here. Either way, he's here." She thought about the rider who had followed them on the road, the one Wyatt had waved off at the valley overlook. That rider had gone back. But Rook could have taken a different route faster, if you knew the territory well enough. "He's not here to deliver another offer," she said. "Vale has the information now. Whatever Rook was supposed to accomplish before I spoke to Vale this morning is already done, or already irrelevant." "So why is he here?" Wyatt said. Nobody answered immediately, because the honest answer was that they didn't know, and speculating out loud about a man like Rook felt like offering the speculation a kind of existence it didn't deserve. "We watch," Mara said. "We don't change anything we're doing because of him." "That's easy to say." She looked at Wyatt. "I know it is. Say it anyway, until it becomes what we actually do." The hearing on the counterclaim was set for 11 days out, which was shorter than Vance had expected, and which he took as a sign that the court wanted to resolve the matter before the federal inquiry deepened its involvement into something that would take the case out of territorial jurisdiction entirely. This was, Vance explained, actually useful. It meant the pressure was working. It meant the court understood that delay was no longer in anyone's institutional interest, and it gave them 11 days to build the presentation. Mara spent those 11 days in Helena, which she had not planned for and which required adjustments. She wrote to Eliza Greer, using the simple cipher they had agreed on, a series of references to sewing matters that meant specific things to communicate that she was safe and needed more time. She wrote to her landlord in Silver Creek to extend her arrangements. She worked with Vance every morning in his office, going through documents, building the sequence, anticipating what Caraway's attorneys would argue and what she needed to be prepared to say. She was a good witness to herself, which was not a thing everyone could manage. She could tell the story without drifting into emotion that would undermine its factual foundation, and she could answer questions under pressure without losing the thread. Vance ran her through likely cross-examination twice, and the second time she was better than the first, which was the direction things needed to go. Wyatt occupied himself with the practical logistics of extended Helena residence, which he managed with the same unsentimental efficiency he brought to everything. He found them reasonable rates at the boarding house for the extended stay. He handled the horses and the equipment. He located a decent eating establishment 3 blocks from Vance's office that served at predictable hours, which mattered when days were full and meals got forgotten. He also, on the third day, told her that he had seen Rook. "Where?" she said. "Outside Vance's building, standing at the corner. He wasn't trying to be invisible, he saw me see him, and he stayed where he was. Same as Silver Creek, watching, not doing. He's reporting back to Vale, telling him what we're doing each day." She thought about it, which means Vale is still deciding something, or waiting for us to make a mistake. Same thing sometimes. She went that afternoon to Vance's office and told him about Rook's positioning outside the building. Vance listened and then did something she had not expected. He walked to his window, confirmed that Rook was indeed visible at the corner below, and then waved. She stared at him. "If he's reporting our activities," Vance said, coming back to his desk, "then we control what activities he sees. Let him watch us prepare. Let him carry back to Vale the image of 2 attorneys and a client working calmly and methodically through documentation." He sat down. If Vale was hoping for signs of panic, Rook's reports are giving him the opposite. That's useful to us. She thought about that. It was, she decided, correct. "You're very calm about being surveilled," she said. "I've been doing this long enough to understand that surveillance is information flowing in both directions," he said. "They see us, we see them seeing us, we shape what they see." He opened the folder on his desk. "Now, the Caraway attorneys will argue that the property transfer was executed in anticipation of creditor, claims that you transferred the deed to your name specifically to hide it from Harold's creditors. I want to walk through your response to that." She pulled her chair closer to the desk. "The transfer was executed 4 months before any creditor contact was made," she said. "They'll argue Harold knew the debt existed when the transfer happened. Harold's account books show no record of any communication from Fitch or his representatives in the months before the transfer. If the debt was a concern of Harold's, he would have noted it. He noted everything. Good. They'll push on the fact that you drove 3 towns to find a clerk, arguing that the distance indicates you were deliberately obscuring the transaction. I'll tell them exactly what I told you, that I chose a clerk who didn't know us because I wanted a clean transaction without local complication. That's not obscurement, that's prudence. And the filing is on record. It was publicly filed. An obscured transaction isn't publicly filed." Vance made a note. Good. They worked for 3 hours. By the end of it, she was tired in the specific way that came from sustained, careful thinking, not exhausted but emptied out, like a vessel that had been filled and used and needed refilling. She went back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed with her coat still on for a long moment, not thinking about anything in particular. Wyatt knocked on the connecting door. "Supper," he said through the wood. "Give me 10 minutes. He gave her 15, which was the difference between what he said and what he understood, and she appreciated it without saying so. 3 days before the hearing, something shifted. Vance received a communication not from the court, not from the federal office, but from Caraway's attorneys. It was written in the careful language of legal correspondence, but its meaning was legible beneath the language. They were requesting a settlement conference. He brought it to Mara and Wyatt that afternoon. "They want to talk," Mara said. "They want to settle," Vance said. "There's a difference. A settlement conference is a formal step. It creates a record that they initiated it, which tells you something about how they're now assessing the hearing. They think they'll lose," Wyatt said. "They think the calculus has changed enough that losing is now a meaningful possibility. The federal inquiry, the counterclaim, the documentation, and whatever Vale took away from his conversation with Mrs. Ellison at the Montana Hotel." He set the letter on the desk. "I recommend we accept the conference." "Why?" Mara said. "If they're weakening, the hearing strengthens our position further." "Yes. But a settlement conference gives us something. The hearing doesn't, the opportunity to shape the outcome directly, rather than relying on a territorial judge who, federal scrutiny notwithstanding, is still a person with relationships and pressures." He looked at her. "At the hearing, we might win and get exactly what the court awards us, which may be less than what we could negotiate directly. Or we win and they appeal and we spend another year in this. He paused. At a settlement conference, we tell them what we'll take to make this end. She thought about it. She had not imagined herself at a table across from Blackridge's people negotiating. She had imagined the hearing her documents, her testimony, the clean machinery of a legal proceeding with a definable outcome. The settlement conference felt murkier, less definable. But Vance was right, and she knew it. I want Vale in that room, she said. Vance raised an eyebrow. Carraway's attorneys will represent. I want Vale, not just lawyers. I want the man who made the decisions sitting across from me when we talk about what those decisions cost. She looked at Vance. Can you make that a condition? He considered it. I can request it. They may refuse. Request it. He wrote the response to Carraway's attorneys that afternoon. The settlement conference was set for the following morning, and the response came back that evening. Vale would attend. She slept poorly that night, which was honest. She lay in the dark of the boarding house room and went through everything she knew and everything she needed and everything she planned to say, and she found the gaps and worked on them. And when she was done working on them, she lay still and let the cold quiet of the Helena night settle around her. At some point, she became aware that the connecting door had opened a crack, just a crack, not open, and that there was light from Wyatt's room showing underneath it. Are you awake? She said. Yes, he said. Are you also staring at the ceiling? A pause, roughly. She turned her head toward the door. I keep thinking about whether Harold would have done any of this differently. A longer pause. What do you land on? I think he would have been angrier, earlier, and it would have made things harder. She thought about it. But I also think he would have found it useful eventually. He was good at directing anger once he'd gotten past the part where it was just hot. Sounds like a reasonable man. He was, mostly. She looked at the ceiling again. Thank you, Wyatt. For what? For not treating this like you're doing me a favor. The silence that followed was the particular kind he produced when something had landed somewhere real, and he was deciding whether to speak to it. You'd have found your way to Vance without me, he said finally. Might have taken longer. That's not what I meant. Another silence. I know, he said. The light under the door stayed on for another hour. She found, after a while, that the fact of it, just the light, just the knowledge that he was on the other side of the wall, also awake, and thinking made the ceiling less relentless to stare at. She fell asleep sometime after that, and when she woke the light was gone, and the morning had arrived with the particular gray determination of a day that intends to be significant. The settlement conference was held in a room at Vance's building his choice deliberately, because it put Carraway's team on ground they didn't own. The room had a long table, 6 chairs, 2 windows facing the street, and a wood stove that Vance had started an hour before so the room would be warm without anyone having to ask for it. Carraway's attorneys were 2, a senior man named Forsyth, who had the careful grooming of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this, and a younger associate who took notes and said nothing. Vale sat beside Forsyth. He looked at Mara when she came in with the specific quality of a man reassessing a prior conclusion, and she met his gaze without expression. Wyatt sat against the wall, not at the table. He was there as a witness and as himself, and his presence at the wall was its own kind of statement, steady, unmovable, watching. Vance opened. He was precise and unhurried, laying out the documented pattern, the federal inquiry, the counterclaim, the strength of Mara's title documentation. He spoke for 12 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, he folded his hands on the table and said, "We are prepared to resolve this today. Our position is simple. The Carraway action is withdrawn with prejudice. The Ellison title is acknowledged as valid and uncontested. The debt matter is retired entirely, with no ongoing claim against the estate." Forsyth responded with the expected counter, a somewhat reduced version of the original position. The debt acknowledged, but the land title question still nominally in play. Mara listened and understood that this was the opening position, not the real one. She waited for Vance to respond, and he did, and they went back and forth twice more, and then Forsyth said something about the federal inquiry being preliminary and potentially without merit, and Mara decided it was time. "Mr. Vale," she said. Forsyth stopped mid-sentence. Vale looked at her. "Your company's representatives came to my husband's house twice," she said. "They made offers that were below the property's value, and they left both times with an expression that I have been told about secondhand, but that I recognize the expression of men who believe that no is a temporary condition in other people." She kept her voice level. It was not difficult. She had been working toward this room for months. "My husband died 6 weeks after receiving a letter that I believe was sent with the purpose of frightening him into compliance. He did not comply. He died. And then your company bought his debt and sent lawyers and hired men to watch my movements and sent a representative to meet with a territorial judge who is known to have flexible relationships with commercial interests." Vale said nothing. "I have documented all of it," she said. My attorney has sent the documentation to the Federal Land Office. 3 other cases in 3 other territories are part of that documentation. The inquiry is not preliminary. It is active, and it will become more active as it proceeds. And the specific name that appears across those cases, Black Ridge Mining, will appear in whatever comes of that inquiry. She looked at him. So I want you to tell me, not your attorneys, but you, what is it worth to your company to have this end here, quietly, without any further development of a federal record that currently exists in one deputy commissioner's office, but will not always be confined to one deputy commissioner's office? The room was very quiet. Vale looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at his papers. The young associate had stopped taking notes. It was not the silence of a negotiation. It was the silence of a calculation completing. Vale said Forsyth. Forsyth cleared his throat. I believe we can discuss a full withdrawal of the Caraway action, acknowledgement of title, and retirement of the debt obligation. In writing, Vance said, executed today. That may require. Today, Mara said. Or the federal inquiry receives the complete documentation this afternoon. Not in portions over the coming weeks, but complete, including the timeline of my husband's death and the letter that preceded it. Another silence. Today, Forsyth said. Vance produced a draft agreement from the folder in front of him, which he had prepared the night before, which Mara had read at 6 in the morning, over bad boarding house coffee, which said precisely what it needed to say, and nothing it didn't. He slid it across the table. Forsyth read it. He made 2 minor requests for language changes, both of which Vance accepted after confirming with Mara. Vale signed it first, which surprised her. She had expected him to let the lawyers carry the final step. But he took the pen and signed with the decisive motion of a man who has decided to own a decision, rather than be seen hiding behind process. She signed after him. Vance countersigned as her attorney. The sung associate witnessed, which was the first thing he had done since entering the room. It was done. She sat for a moment after the Caraway team left, the signed agreement on the table in front of her. Vance was reviewing his copy with the focused attention of a man confirming that everything was where it needed to be. Wyatt was still against the wall. He had not moved from it once during the entire proceeding. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing in his expression that was triumphant, and she was glad of it, because triumph felt wrong for this room, for this outcome. What she felt was not triumph. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has held a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has now set it down, and whose arms do not yet know what to do with the absence of the weight. It's done, she said, not to anyone in particular. Just said it into the room to hear what it sounded like. It sounded true. Vance looked up from his copy of the agreement. The federal inquiry will continue independently of this settlement, he said. Your documentation stays in their record. This doesn't close that. I know, she said. That's the part that's supposed to continue. Harold's account book was still in Vance's safe. The threatening letter. The dated record of visits and refusals, and the fever that came too soon after both. None of that was resolved. None of that would ever be fully resolved in the way she had sometimes in weak moments imagined it might be. But it was in the hands of people who would use it the way it needed to be used, and that was what she had been able to do, and she had done it. She stood up, put on her coat, and looked at Wyatt. I want to go back to the boarding house, she said. I want to sleep for approximately 12 hours, and then I want to make a decision about what comes next. He pushed off from the wall. I'll walk with you, he said. They went out into the Helena cold together, the street loud and indifferent around them, signed agreement in Vance's folder behind them, and ahead of them the question of what a person does with herself when the thing she came to do is finished, and the rest of her life is still there, waiting to be decided. She slept for 10 hours, which was too short of what she had promised herself, and woke in the gray Helena morning with the particular clarity that sometimes follows sustained exhaustion not rested exactly, but emptied of the noise that had been running underneath everything for weeks, quiet in a way that allowed her to hear herself think without interference. She lay still for a while and thought about Pennsylvania. The land had been an abstraction for most of her marriage, a thing Harold owned the way people own things they've inherited, and never quite decided what to do with. She had been to it twice. The first time, early in their marriage, when Harold's uncle had still been alive and had wanted to show it to them with the particular pride of an old man presenting something he intended to leave behind. The second time, after the uncle died, when they had driven out to walk the perimeter, and Harold had stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the blue-green rock exposed on the bank and said, in the casual way he had of marking things he intended to think about later, that it was strange country. Beautiful, he'd said, but strange. She had not understood what he meant then. She understood now. She got up, washed her face, and dressed. She knocked on the connecting door. I'm going to Pennsylvania, she said when Wyatt opened it. He looked at her. He was already dressed, which meant he had been up for a while, which was consistent with his general habit of rising before the world required it. When, he said. Soon. Within the week if the roads south are passable. She leaned against the doorframe. I need to see the land, not for sentiment. I need to see it because Tom Aldred told me what the rock might mean, and I've been making decisions about this property for months, without ever having stood on it with that knowledge. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going back to Silver Creek first, he said. I need to go to Pennsylvania first, before I go anywhere else. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to come, I know. But if you wanted to. When do we leave, he said. She felt something in her chest move, the way things move when they have been braced for resistance and find none. She did not make a production of it. I need 2 days to finish things with Vance, she said. Then we leave. Vance spent those 2 days being thorough in the way she had come to rely on him for. He prepared a summary of the settlement agreement for the Federal Land Office, attached to the full documentation package, and sent it with a cover letter that laid out the pattern of Blackridge's acquisition practices across all 4 territories, clearly enough that a federal official reading it, for the first time, would understand immediately what they were looking at. He filed the acknowledgement of Mara's title with the territorial court. He sent copies of everything to a second attorney in Pennsylvania, a man he knew in Pittsburgh, with instructions to register the settlement in the relevant county records, so that the acknowledged title existed on both ends of the country and could not be quietly challenged in either jurisdiction without the challenge being visible in the other. On the second afternoon, he sat across from her at his desk and said, There's something I want to tell you that is not legal advice. She looked at him. In 2 weeks, she had learned that Vance rarely said anything he hadn't fully constructed in advance, which made the statement itself a kind of signal. Go ahead, she said. The federal inquiry will take time. Months, possibly longer. I don't know what it will ultimately find or what consequences it will produce, if any. Federal processes are not guaranteed to arrive at just outcomes just because the evidence warrants them. He paused. But the inquiry exists. The record exists. Your husband's account book is in that record. The 3 other cases are in that record. And records have a way of persisting past the moment they're created in ways that no one can fully predict. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that what you brought here mattered, not just to your title. To the larger thing, she held his gaze for a moment. Harold would have liked knowing that, she said. I suspect he would have. She shook Vance's hand when she left, which he received with the same non-adjusted firmness as the first time, and she thought that was exactly right. The road south from Helena toward the rail connections that would eventually get them to Pennsylvania was easier than the road from Silver Creek had been lower elevation, less accumulated snow, the horses moving with the more relaxed energy of animals who can feel that the terrain is not working against them. They rode the first day in the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to process it aloud, and camped at a way station that was marginally better than the one on the way in. On the second day, somewhere in the long flat stretch where the road opened up, and the sky came down to meet it on all sides, Wyatt said, What are you going to do with it, if the survey confirms what Aldred thinks? She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the settlement conference. Since the moment Vale's pen had moved across the paper and the land had become unambiguously hers again, and she had felt, underneath the relief, the weight of a new question replacing the old one. I'm not going to sell it to Blackridge, she said. Obviously. I'm not going to sell it to anyone who operates the way they operate. Anyone who thinks that what a piece of ground is worth is determined by how efficiently they can extract it and leave. She looked at the road ahead. But I'm also not going to pretend I can manage a mining operation myself, or that holding on to land I've never lived on out of principle is a sustainable position. So I find someone else, a smaller company or an independent operation. Someone who has to negotiate fairly because they don't have the resources to do anything else. She paused. And I negotiate the terms myself. Mineral rights with conditions. Environmental protections if the federal framework allows for them. A fair royalty structure. She looked at him. Harold said no to Blackridge because their offer was too low and because he didn't trust them. Both were correct. But the land still has what it has underneath it, and pretending otherwise doesn't honor him. It just wastes what he protected. Wyatt rode alongside her for a moment. That's practical, he said. He was practical when it mattered, she said. I learned it from him. They reached Pennsylvania in Stage's train from the Southern Rail connection, then a hired wagon for the last 40 miles into the county where the land sat. She had written ahead to the county clerk, the same one who had filed the transfer 3 towns over, to confirm that the acknowledgement of her title had been received. It had. The clerk's reply was brief and professional and contained no memory of her, which was exactly what she had paid for with that extra 40 miles. The land was accessed by a dirt road that branched off the main county road and descended through a stand of mixed hardwood before opening onto the property. She had not been sure, on the way in, that she would recognize it. It had been years, and grief had a way of blurring the details of things encountered before and after it. But she recognized it. The particular way the trees gave way, the shape of the hill to the north, the sound of the creek which she heard before she saw it, the specific vocal quality of water moving over rock in the cold. She got down from the wagon and walked to the creek bank. The rock was there, blue, green, and gray in the places where the water had worn the bank back, unmistakable once you knew what to look for, which she did now, because Tom Aldred had described it to her carefully, and she had listened carefully, and the description matched what was in front of her with the precision of something already confirmed rather than something being discovered for the first time. Wyatt came and stood beside her. He looked at the rock. "Serpentine," she said. He crouched down and looked at it more closely with the focused attention of a man who trusted his eyes. "And the creek runs the right direction." "Yes." He stood back up. They stood at the creek bank together in the Pennsylvania cold, which was a different cold from Montana wetter, heavier, the kind that got into the wool rather than moving around it. The trees on the far bank were bare, their branches making a complicated gray pattern against the white sky. "Harold stood here," she said. "It wasn't a question. You told me he did. He stood here and looked at this rock and said it was strange country." She looked at the rock. "He didn't know what he was looking at. He just knew it was strange. And he refused to sell it twice because he trusted that instinct even when he couldn't name what it was based on." She thought about what that meant, a man protecting something he didn't fully understand, by a reflex that came from some combination of stubbornness and instinct, and the simple unwillingness to be pushed. A man who documented everything in cramped handwriting in account books that he probably thought were just for his own reference. A man who kept letters he should have shared sooner, who carried worry privately in ways that cost him, who was not perfect and was not always right, and who had, without knowing it, handed her everything she needed to fight for what was his. She did not cry. She had cried for Harold in private in the specific moments that ambushed her, not this one. This one felt different. This one felt like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing the destination. "I'm going to have it surveyed properly," she said. "There's an independent geological firm in Pittsburgh that Vance's contact recommended. If the survey confirms what Aldred described, I'll start the process of finding the right buyer for the mineral rights." "How long will that take? The survey?" 6 to 8 weeks, they told me. "The negotiation after, I don't know. It depends on what they find and who I talk to." She turned away from the creek and looked back up the slope toward the trees. "I'll stay in the county while the survey runs. There's a boarding house in the nearest town." "I'll stay with you," he said. She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without loading it with more weight than it could carry, letting it mean exactly what it meant. "You don't have to," she said. "I know your cabin. Your trimp season. The cabin will be there. The trapping will be there." He looked at the creek. "I've been alone in that cabin for 7 years. A few more weeks in Pennsylvania isn't going to dissolve anything." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first time she had knocked on his door with soup, about the key he had put on the table without ceremony, about the cold weather gear in her size, purchased without being asked, presented without drama, about him at the wall during the settlement conference, still and steady, not doing anything except being there, which had turned out to be exactly the right thing. She thought about the particular loneliness she had brought with her to Montana, the kind that is not the absence of people, but the absence of a person who sees you correctly, and how that loneliness had changed shape over 4 months of Tuesdays and Fridays, without either of them naming the change or asking what it meant. "All right," she said, "stay." The survey took 7 weeks. The geological firm sent 2 men who spent the first week walking every inch of the property with instruments she didn't recognize, and notebooks they filled with writing she couldn't read. They took rock samples from the creek bank and from 2 other locations on the property where the same blue-green formation surfaced. They sent the samples to a laboratory in Pittsburgh. They came back for the second week to take additional samples from a location on the north slope that the first samples had indicated warranted closer examination. Mara occupied herself during those 7 weeks with a discipline she had developed over years of difficult waiting. She found useful things to do, and she did them. And she let the waiting be what it was without filling it with speculation that couldn't be resolved until the results arrived. She wrote letters. She corresponded with Vance, who sent updates on the federal inquiry, slow but continuing, he wrote, in the particular way of processes that are too large to move quickly, but that do not stop. She corresponded with Eliza Greer, who wrote back in her direct and affectionate way, and included a note at the end of the last letter that said, "Silver Creek is smaller without you. which I intend as a fact rather than a manipulation. She wrote back, I know exactly what you intend it as, and I appreciate it anyway. Wyatt occupied himself with the property itself. He was not a man who could sit still in rented rooms for 7 weeks, and the Pennsylvania land gave him legitimate things to do: fences that needed attention, drainage on the upper slope that was causing erosion, a section of the access road that was badly rutted and made wagon passage unreliable. He worked on these things without being asked, without making a declaration of intent, simply by getting up in the morning and going to the place where something needed doing and doing it. She watched him one afternoon from the edge of the tree line, resetting a fence post with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who understands the mechanics of what they're doing well enough that they don't have to think about them. The Pennsylvania light was flat and gray, the trees still bare, the ground still winter hard. He worked in it without complaint and without performance, and she thought that this was the quality she had noticed first about him, and had kept noticing the complete absence of theater. He did not need to be seen doing a thing in order to do it. She thought about what it meant that this man had driven 4 days to Helena with her, signed a retainer split with her, sat against a wall for 2 hours in a room full of lawyers without once trying to take over what was hers to handle, and had then followed her to Pennsylvania because she had said she was going, and he had decided, with the same private simplicity of all his decisions, that he was going too. She had not asked him how he felt about any of it. It was not their way. They did not ask each other to narrate interior states that were already legible if you were paying attention, and she had been paying attention for 7 months. But there was a conversation that needed to happen, and she had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment was not a thing she could engineer, and she had finally decided to stop waiting for it to arrive and simply speak. She walked down to where he was working. He looked up. He didn't stop what he was doing immediately. He finished the thing he was doing with the post, set the tool down, and then looked at her properly. The survey results come next week, she said. I know. After that, whatever they show, I'll be able to make a decision about the sale. It won't happen overnight, but the process will have a shape. He nodded. And then I'll need to decide where I go, she said. After he was quiet, looking at her with the attentive stillness that she had learned to read as his fullest form of listening. I came to Montana because I needed to be somewhere I hadn't watched Harold die, she said. That was true when I arrived. It stayed true for a while, but somewhere in the last 7 months it stopped being the reason I was there. She looked at him. You know what the reason became. He looked at her for a moment. Then I have a general idea. I'm not asking you to say something you're not ready to say, she said. I know how you move through things. I know it's not fast. I'm not built for fast myself, regardless of what the last several months might suggest. Something crossed his face, the shape of a thing trying not to be a smile and not entirely succeeding. You drove to Helena in winter and confronted a mining company's senior representative at 8 in the morning, he said. That was necessity. Necessity and personal pace are different things. Fair. He picked up the tool and set it down again in the particular way of a man whose hands need something to do while he thinks. I've been alone in that cabin for 7 years because after Eleanor I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do with anyone else. Not because I was waiting. Because I genuinely couldn't see it. He paused. And then someone turned a map right side up on my road and started showing up on Tuesdays and Fridays with soup. And I noticed somewhere around the 3rd or 4th Tuesday that I was listening for her coming up the road before she arrived, which was not something I had done in 7 years. She looked at him. That's what I have, he said. It's not large. It's exactly the right size, she said. The survey results arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a writer from the geological firm in Pittsburgh. The lead surveyor had written a cover letter that summarized the findings in language designed to be understood by someone who was not a geologist, and Mara read it at the kitchen table of the rented rooms with Wyatt across from her and went through it twice before she looked up. Copper, she said. Substantial deposit, he says. The north slope has the highest concentration. There's also tin, as Aldred predicted, though in smaller quantities. She set the letter down. He estimates the total mineral value of the deposit at somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 at current extraction prices, depending on depth and quality. Wyatt looked at the letter. He did not say anything for a moment. Harold refused $12,000, she said. Yes. He was right. They were offering him a fraction. He was right, Wyatt said. He just didn't know by how much. She folded the letter and held it for a moment. $60,000 to $90,000. It was a number that changed the character of the air in the room, not because it made everything suddenly simple, but because it made everything suddenly real in a way that abstraction hadn't. She had been fighting for months, for land she knew was valuable without knowing the specific weight of that value, and now she knew, and it was heavier than she had let herself fully imagine. The company in Pittsburgh that Vance's contact recommended, she said. The independent one. I'm going to write to them today. What terms are you going to ask for? She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since Tom Aldred had said copper and tin in his kitchen in Silver Creek, since Vance had said your documents make the argument, since she had stood at the creek bank and looked at the blue-green rock and understood what Harold had protected without knowing he was protecting it. Mineral rights only, she said. I retain surface ownership. Royalty at 15% of gross extraction value paid quarterly. Environmental conditions, no diversion of the creek. Restoration requirements on the north slope when extraction is complete. And a clause that voids the agreement if the company is acquired by or enters into partnership with Black Ridge Mining or any of its affiliated entities. Wyatt looked at her. I wrote it out last week, she said, when I was waiting for the survey. You wrote out the terms while you were waiting for the survey that would tell you whether there was anything to negotiate. I needed something to do in the evenings. He looked at her for another moment with the expression she had come to think of as his particular version of admiration, which looked from the outside like a man trying to stay neutral and not entirely managing it. 15% is aggressive, he said, I know. I'll take 12 if they push. But I'm starting at 15 because Harold started by saying no entirely, and I think I can afford to start somewhere between his position and theirs. The negotiation took 3 weeks. The Pittsburgh firm, a partnership called Garrett and Hale that had been operating for 12 years and had a reputation, verified by Vance's contact, for operating within the law and within their agreements, sent a representative who was a practical man in his 40s named Samuel Garrett, who looked at the survey results and at Mara's written terms and said, in the plain style of someone who respected plain dealing, the 15% is high. 12.5, she said, with the environmental conditions and the anti-Black Ridge clause non-negotiable. He looked at the anti-Black Ridge clause. He had read it already, she could tell by the quality of his pause, which was the pause of a man revisiting rather than reading for the first time. You've had dealings with them, he said. Yes. The clause will hold regardless of what form any acquisition takes: subsidiary, partnership, license arrangement.
Correct. My attorney and Helena drafted it. He looked at it again.
12.5, he said. With your conditions. Yes. He put out his hand. She shook it. She signed the mineral rights agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in the office of the county clerk, a different clerk than the one 3 towns over, because this was a different kind of transaction, one she wanted firmly in the local record. She signs with the same pen she had used to sign the settlement agreement in Helena, which she had kept in her coat pocket since that morning in Vance's conference room. Not for sentiment, but because she liked the continuity of it. The clerk witnessed. Garrett's associate witnessed. Wyatt, who had come with her, witnessed. When it was done and the copies were made and the handshakes were finished, she walked out of the county clerk's office into the Pennsylvania afternoon and stood on the step for a moment and breathed. The air was different here than in Montana, heavier as she had noticed before, wetter and softer. The trees along the road were beginning to show the first tentative suggestions of spring buds on the hardwoods. Not open yet, but present, the particular living quality of things that are about to begin. Harold had stood on this same county step, she imagined, when he had first registered the inheritance, probably not thinking much about it, probably thinking about getting back to town before dark, about what was for supper, about the ordinary logistics of an ordinary day, not knowing what he was leaving. She thought about what he had said to her once, early in their marriage, when she had asked him why he kept such detailed records of everything: the account books, the dated notes, the careful log of what he spent and said and decided. He had looked at her with the slightly sheepish expression of a man who has been caught at something he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. And he had said, I suppose I just want there to be a record that I was here, that I did things, that it mattered, it had mattered. She was standing on the other side of the proof of that. They left Pennsylvania on a Friday, heading back west by train, then the long road north toward Montana. She had arranged for the county clerk to send copies of the mineral rights agreement and the title acknowledgement to Vance and Helena, who would add them to the permanent file. She had written a final letter to Garrett establishing the quarterly royalty schedule and the contact information for her attorney. She had settled her account at the boarding house and said goodbye to the landlady, who had been decent to her without being warm, which was its own kind of decent. On the train, somewhere in the long middle passage of the country where the landscape flattened and the sky became enormous, she sat beside the window and watched the country go past and thought about the question she had not finished, answering the one about where she went after. Silver Creek was not the answer, she had decided. It had been a place she had landed, not a place she had chosen, and it had served its purpose, but she had outgrown the rented room and the specific economy of its social world and the particular quality of judgment that Dorothea Hatch represented. She could return to it and she would not be destroyed by it, but she didn't want to return to it. Pennsylvania was not the answer. The land would generate income, a quarterly royalty from Garrett and Hale that would give her a financial stability she had not had since Harold died. But the land was a source, not a destination. Montana was the answer, which she had known for weeks and had been letting herself approach from a distance, because it was important to arrive at it for the right reasons, rather than for the reason that a man in a cabin had put a key on his table and started coffee before she knocked. That was a reason. But it was not the only reason, and it needed to not be the only reason. She wanted the mountains. She had discovered this herself over the months in Silver Creek, and it had surprised her, because she was not a woman who had previously thought of herself as having strong opinions about landscape. But the specific quality of Montana, the scale of it, the way it required you to be physically present and capable just to move through it, the way it did not accommodate people who needed to be comfortable in order to function, had entered her somehow and become something she did not want to give up. She wanted a life that was her own construction, not restored from what she had lost with Harold, not dependent on rescue or charity, or the goodwill of people who were inclined to underestimate her, but built from her own materials with her own hands. The royalty from Garrett and Hale would give her the financial foundation for that. Montana, she thought, would give her the place. And Wyatt was not the reason. But he was part of the reason, and the difference between those two things mattered enormously, and she intended to keep it clear. She said some of this to him on the train, not all at once but across the long hours of the Middle Passage, in the way their conversations had always worked, not planned discussions, but things that rose to the surface when the conditions were right, like the blue-green rock rising where the creek had worn the bank back. He listened with the quality she had come to rely on. He asked, at one point, "You're sure it's Montana and not somewhere easier?" "Easier isn't a value I'm optimizing for," she said. "I know. I'm asking if you're choosing it for its own sake or choosing it because it's where I am." She appreciated that he asked it directly. It deserved a direct answer. "Both," she said. "And I've thought about whether that's a problem, and I've decided it's not. Two true things can both be true. I'm not going to pretend I'd pick the same county if you lived somewhere else. But I'm also not going to pretend that what I want from Montana is just proximity to you. That's not what it is." He was quiet for a while, looking out the window at the country going past. "I want you to have the room at the front of the cabin," he said. "It gets better light in the morning." She looked at him. "The layout is sensible," he said. "You can think in the morning. I don't need light to make coffee." She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers back, steady as he always was, the man who had spent 7 years choosing solitude and had discovered, Tuesday by Tuesday, that the choice was not as permanent as he had believed. "All right," she said, "the front room." They arrived back in Montana in early spring, when the snow was retreating from the lower elevations, and the road from the rail station to Silver Creek was mud-heavy but passable. She went first to Eliza's shop, which felt necessary in the way that certain things are necessary, not because they are practical, but because they are right. Eliza looked at her for a long moment and then embraced her, which was unusual for Eliza, who was not a physically demonstrative person. Mara held on for a moment and then stepped back. "You look different," Eliza said. "I've been traveling for months." "That's not what I mean." Eliza looked at her with the sharp, accurate eyes of someone who seasons through things for a living. "It went well. It went as well as it could have. And the land? Mine. Legally uncontested, generating income." She paused. "I signed a mineral rights agreement with an independent firm. 12.5% royalty quarterly." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Harold would have been pleased. "I think he would have argued about the percentage," Mara said. "He would have said I could have gotten 13. Eliza smiled a rare full smile, not the smaller version she usually deployed. "He might have been right. He might have," Mara agreed. "He usually was about numbers." She told Eliza she would not be renewing the room at the boarding house. She told her she was going up to the mountain cabin. She said it plainly, without qualification or apology, and Eliza received it the same way plainly, without making it larger than it was or smaller than it was. "Come back on Tuesdays," Eliza said. "I'll keep the tea on." "Fridays too," Mara said, "if that's all right." "Fridays too." The road up to the cabin was familiar now, in the way roads become familiar. When you have traveled them in different weathers, in different states of mind, she knew the specific bump 2/3 of the way up, the place where the road curved and the valley came suddenly visible on the left, the last stand of pine before the cabin clearing opened. She knew these things the way you know the habits of a place you have been returning to, and the knowing of them settled something in her chest that she had not realized was still unsettled. Wyatt had ridden ahead to open the cabin and get the fire going. She had let him, understanding that he needed the few minutes alone with his home before she arrived in it permanently, which was a different thing from arriving on a Tuesday with soup. She tied her horse at the post and stood for a moment outside the door. The smoke was already rising from the chimney. She could smell it, the particular wood smoke of his stove, which she could now distinguish from other wood smoke in the way you can distinguish the specific sounds of a voice you know well from all other voices. She could hear faintly the movement inside him building the fire to a proper heat, the sounds of a man making a place ready. She thought about the first night she had stood at this door, in the dark, with her pot of venison's stew, knowing he was coming home and having made a decision she didn't fully understand yet to be here when he arrived. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she had made too much soup. She knew now that she had been doing something much older and more essential than practicality she had been reaching, across the particular loneliness that had followed Harold's death, toward the possibility that she was not finished, that the life ahead was not just a managed continuation of the life before, that she had something left to build. She had built it. Not finished, you don't finish a life you're still living, but started. On foundations, she had laid herself from materials she had gathered and shaped with her own hands. With help she had accepted not from weakness, but from the clear-eyed understanding that choosing to do something alone when good company is available is not strength. It's just stubbornness with a better reputation. She opened the door. The cabin was warm. The fire was going. On the table, 2 plates sat in their familiar arrangement, with the particular exactness of a man who does things once and then repeats them without variation, because he has decided they are right. Wyatt was at the stove, his back to her. He heard her come in. She knew he heard by the slight change in the quality of his stillness, but he did not turn around immediately. He gave her a moment, which was the right thing, which he always seemed to know. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door, the peg on the left, because he used the one on the right. And they had arrived at this arrangement without discussion sometime in the fall, the way they arrived at most arrangements. She sat down at the table. He turned around and looked at her. She looked back at him. There was nothing in the moment that needed to be said, which was not emptiness, but the opposite, the full, settled quality of 2 people who have been through something real together and have arrived somewhere they both recognize, and who understand that recognition does not require announcement. She picked up her fork. He sat down across from her. Outside, the Montana spring was doing its slow, determined work, the cold receding, the ground softening, the things that had waited through the winter beginning to consider the possibility of returning. It was not a graceful process. It was muddy and uneven, and it happened at its own pace and on its own terms, indifferent to whether you were ready. She had found over the past year that she respected that about it. There are people the world writes off because they take up too much space, or move too slowly, or carry their grief visibly, or refuse to give way when giving way would be easier. There are people who get told, in 100 small and large ways, that they are too much or not enough, that their survival depends on becoming smaller, quieter, more willing to concede. And there are people who hear all of that and carry it, because you cannot choose not to hear the world, but who refuse, in the quietest and most essential part of themselves, to let the hearing become agreement. Mara Ellison had carried a great deal. She had been underestimated by a town, threatened by a company, watched by a hired man, and dismissed, at various points, by nearly everyone, except the 2 people who mattered most: a husband, who had trusted his instincts about a piece of strange land, and a man who had listened for her footsteps on a road before she arrived. She had not won because she was exceptional. She had won because she refused to stop, in the particular way of people who understand that stopping is the only real defeat, and that everything else is just a temporary difficulty requiring a next move. The venison stew was good. The fire was warm. The cabin, which had been built for 1 person and had held 1 person's grief for 7 years, held 2 people now, and if it was not yet entirely sure what to do with that, it was adjusting, the way all solid things adjust when asked to hold something new, not breaking, not resisting, simply making room. She had made room. He had made room. That was enough to begin.